Chapter 694. Naturally, Su Yunxing had his own reasons for saying this. First, he found that this old man named Zhang Shibao was very honest. Otherwise, even if he saw through it, there was no need to say it. Because sometimes a wrong word could cost one's life. Secondly, he felt that Zhang Shibao still had a good impression of him, or rather, of Ming Ren. Third, even if he made a wrong judgment, he was confident that he could make the other party stay and not let the news of him appearing here spread. Since that was the case, there was no harm in directly revealing his identity. It had to be said that Su Yunxing's courage was quite big, and this time he made the right bet. Just after he reported his true identity, Zhang Shibao changed his unhurried expression and suddenly said with a shocked expression, "The Duke of Loyalty and Courage of the Great Ming Dynasty? Is it the Duke of Loyalty who is known as the God of War and defeated the Great Army?" Zhang Shibao also knew the name of the God of War. At that time, Yang Qindong had won against many and defeated Zhou Xian. Because of this, his name was spread throughout the Mongolian grasslands. It was normal for Zhang Shibao, who had Han blood, to know about it. Yes. When Su Yunxing answered this question, he was also very formal and his expression was very respectful. It was like the officials of the Ming dynasty were respectful when talking about the emperor. Is it really? The God of War is coming to the grassland? Zhang Shibao was a little excited. He stretched out his arm and grabbed Su Yunxing's arm. Yes, the God of War is not only coming to the grassland, but he also wants to build a city here. He wants to change the pattern of war here. He wants to create better living conditions for the Han people here. And Argamaki is his next target. He wants to occupy this place and rebuild it. At that time you will be very happy to live here. Su Yunxing felt that Zhang Shibao was really excited, so he simply told him about his mission and Yang Qindong's current goal. It seemed to be a secret, but after tonight, everyone would know that Yang Qindong had occupied Argamaki. It was no longer a secret. Su Yunxing told the truth, which surprised Zhang Shibao and made him very excited. Good, that's great. After saying good 3 times in a row, Zhang Shibao's eyes actually held a trace of tears. Obviously, this news really made him very excited. Su Yunxing was also excited and happy as if he had been infected. Look, this was what the people wanted. The 6th young master hadn't done anything yet, but his appearance had already made an old man like Zhang Shibao so happy. Once a big city was built here, there would be even more people who would be happy. Once he had the support of the people, what was there to worry about? That's right. With the arrival of the war god, the future of the Han people will be much better. As long as they abide by the law, they will be able to live a better life than before. This should be what everyone wants to see. Su Yunxing nodded and continued with the idea of praising the 6th young master. Zhang Shibao's eyes lit up when he heard that. Then he repeated thoughtfully, "Can the Han people really live a good life?" Of course. You don't understand the war god. He has always been merciful to his enemies, but he is very good to the Han people. I'm afraid you still don't know that the former Jiaoji and Lansong kingdoms are now under the rule of the war god. The Han people there received a large amount of land and their lives are better than before by 100 times. If you have the chance to go there and take a look, you will see that the Han people's faces are filled with all sorts of smiles. That is happiness from the bottom of their hearts. A large amount of land that belongs to them. Zhang Shibao continued to repeat. His eyes revealed a look of yearning. Yenda and the 2 soldiers saw this and couldn't help but feel happy. This was because they also had a part to play in this matter. Just when the 5 of them were immersed in the hope of a beautiful future, Zhang Shibao's thoughts suddenly returned to reality. He looked at Su Yunxing and said, "You guys should be here to act as the vanguard and prepare to occupy this place. Have you guys thought of how to deal with the Mongol cavalry? Also, how can we prevent them from destroying this spring in their desperation?" Su Yunxing was about to confidently say that it was just 500 unguarded cavalry. Their reconnaissance unit would naturally be able to take them down easily. However, when he suddenly heard about the spring, his face was still filled with shock. Spring? What spring? You guys don't know? Zhang Shibao also looked at Su Yunxing and the other 3 with a puzzled expression. I really don't know. Please tell me, Elder Zhang. Su Yunxing's face was a little red as he lowered his head. Speaking of which, although the reconnaissance unit was powerful, it wasn't as pervasive as the security bureau. In addition, Yang Qindong had just given the order to take down Alchemy, so it was reasonable that he didn't fully understand the situation here. This actually is not a big secret. However, not many people know about it. Alchemy City, there is a spring here. It is also because of this that the problem of water source is solved. This is also the main reason why the great Ming dynasty chose to build a city here. Otherwise, wouldn't it be too troublesome to transport water from the Wulagu River? There are only about 1,000 people here. There are indeed 500 Tatar cavalrymen guarding this place. In fact, they are guarding this water source. Every half a month or so, the Tatar army will come here with water carts to collect water. The 500 cavalrymen here are prepared for this. From Zhang Shibao's words, Su Yunxing learned of another big matter. He also knew that tomorrow the Tatar army would come to collect water. This unexpected news shocked Su Yunxing. He suddenly felt that he knew too little about this place. Even if it was because this was the first time they came here, even if it was because they hadn't come here the last time the Tatar army came to collect water, these were not the reason. The most fatal reason was that he didn't know enough. His meeting with Zhang Shibao was just a coincidence. However, he unexpectedly received this news, which was enough to make Su Yunxing feel that this trip was not in vain. If not for this matter, he would have brought the scouts here. It was very likely that he would have given the Tatar cavalry a chance to destroy the water source in the spring. Once they poisoned it, who knew how long it would take for the spring to be digested and for the people to drink it with ease. After Zhang Shibao knew that Su Yunxing represented the god of war, he told him everything. When it was almost dusk, Su Yunxing left. Before he left all the food on him as a sign of gratitude and asked Zhang Shibao to keep this a secret. The four of them left Alchemy as though they were passing by. Because there were only 4 of them, even if the Tatar cavalry in the city saw them, they didn't pay much attention. This was because, strictly speaking, Alchemy wasn't under anyone's influence and no one wanted to forcibly occupy this place. After Su Yunxing and the other 3 left Alchemy, they immediately rushed to the command center. After dinner, they appeared in the headquarters. Su Yunxing hurriedly went to the command center to meet Yang Qindong. The matter of the spring was also somewhat out of Yang Qindong's expectations. Before this, he didn't receive any relevant information. But now that he knew, it was naturally a good thing. Previously, he was still thinking that once the first city was built, it would be troublesome to obtain water from the Wulagu River. He was even thinking about digging a canal. Now that he knew that there was a spring in the city, and according to Zhang Shibao's words, the spring seemed to be quite big. In the past, when Alchemy had a population of tens of thousands, it wasn't difficult to supply water. This was equivalent to a gift from the heavens. We must protect the safety of the spring. How about this? Arrange the Wolf Fang special forces to complete this task. Your scouts only need to follow the plan and do what you want. As for the water-fetching team sent by the Tatar army tomorrow, leave it to Tiger's Mane's independent regiment. They just changed from infantry to cavalry and can be used to train the troops. Yang Qindong made a decision after thinking for a while. Su Yunxing quickly left, along with the Wolf Fang special forces led by Tiger's Mane. As the military system continued to expand, the strength of the army also continued to increase. The mission of the Wolf Fang special forces had already changed. In Yang Qindong's words, their mission was mainly to carry out beheading operations and special undercover missions. This time, protecting the spring in Alchemy City belonged to the undercover mission. After receiving the military order, Tiger's Mane quietly set off with a group of members. This night for Alchemy City was no different from any other night. When night fell, the city became quiet as usual. Apart from the 100 cavalrymen who were responsible for the normal night patrol, there was not a sound to be heard. Perhaps it was because no one had any ideas about this place for a long time, or perhaps it was because there was simply no place worth other people's attention. In short, the 100 cavalrymen patrolling would only make a symbolic trip once every 2 hours. Then they would gather at a lit bonfire in the city to rest their feet. An almost abandoned city, a city without many citizens, a city without many resources, a city without a very good geographical location. If not for the existence of a thick spring which could still be considered useful, there would not even be 500 cavalrymen. How could such a place have a heavy military force, and how could it be so tightly guarded? Therefore, when Tiger's Mane brought a group of Special Forces members into this place, they did not encounter any obstruction at all. They followed the map that Su Yunxing obtained from Elder Zhang Shibao and rushed to the spring. Chapter 695. The mouth of the spring was located in the middle of a courtyard that was not small. Rather than calling it the mouth of the spring, it would be more accurate to call it a well. Just beside the mouth of the spring there was a pond in the courtyard. It was already filled with water and looked extremely clear. At night, a bright moon hung upside down in the water, giving people the feeling that they could fish the moon out of the water. Tai Hu and the others came to the high wall beside the small courtyard from all directions. Each of them was like a nimble fox, not making any sound or movement. After they observed closely from the surrounding rooftops, they noticed that there were dozens of breathing sounds coming from the row of houses beside the pond. Some were light, some were heavy, but most of them seemed to have entered a state of sleep. Since Zhang Xirbao said that the Tatar cavalry might drug the mouth of the spring and destroy the water quality here, Tai Hu and the others had to be prepared. With a signal, the 20 members divided into different directions and began to divide the work. Some of them continued to monitor with their guns, some began to enter the small courtyard or the various exits near the mouth of the spring, and some had already jumped off the rooftops and approached the row of houses where the breathing sounds were coming from. Skinny Monkey was the most agile member. He was the first to arrive in front of the houses. Unknowingly, a weapon similar to a modern grenade had appeared in his hand. This was not a normal grenade but a smoke bomb. Once it was fired, it would release a pungent smell, causing people to lose their ability to judge for a certain period of time and lose more than 70% of their mobility. Skinny Monkey was the first to arrive, followed by King Kong, Violent Ape and the others. Each of them guarded a door holding a smoke bomb in their hands. When all of them were in place, they looked at each other and 6 smoke bombs were suddenly thrown from the windows into the 6 rooms. In the silent night, the smoke bombs made a sound in unison. Oh, puff, choke. About 4 to 5 seconds later, there were bursts of shouts, curses and screams coming from the houses. These sounds should have been like thunder in the silent night, but the sound of the cavalry charging at the city gate covered everything, so the sounds made here did not attract too much attention from the outside. Even though no one was paying attention, it didn't mean that the members of the special forces would go easy on them. On the contrary, their attacks began at the same time. The smoke grenades emitted a pungent smell, causing the Tatar cavalry to rush out of their rooms. Then, like dumplings, they were knocked out one after another. There were only 6 rooms, but 50 Tatar cavalry rushed out of them. In the end, apart from 2 people who resisted fiercely and suffered light injuries, the other 48 people were knocked out before they could even figure out what had happened. Search. After taking control of the situation, Iron Tiger gave the order. The members of Wolf Fong worked together and quickly found a large amount of poison in the room. Among them they found a lot of arsenic, nux vomica and other things. These things melted in water and after being consumed, they would appear to be poisoned. It was hard to imagine what would have happened if Su Yunxing hadn't found out about it. If the mercenaries didn't know that the water source had been destroyed, what would have happened after the army drank the water? Come, bring the 2 wounded over here and let them drink the water in this pool. Iron Tiger was shocked and a little angry. Looking at the 2 wounded Tatar cavalry, he couldn't help but feel angry. If the 6th young master hadn't said that building the city required too much manpower, he would have killed them. But he could avoid the death penalty, so let them taste the water. If there really was a problem, they could only blame their bad luck. There was no time to poison them, or it could be said that they didn't think that someone would target them, so there was naturally no problem with the water. The 2 Tatar cavalry calmly drank the water. Seeing that everyone was safe, Iron Tiger let out a sigh of relief. He ordered his men to guard this place and not allow anyone to come close without orders. On the streets of Arakumaki, the sounds of killing had already become one. When the appointed time arrived, the cavalry of the reconnaissance unit began their attack. The first to be attacked were the 100 Tatar cavalry responsible for tonight's night watch. They thought that it would be an ordinary night like any other. But no one expected that the enemy would suddenly appear. While they were still far away, the sound of arrows piercing through the air could be heard. Most of the Tatar cavalry didn't even have time to react before they were injured. A few of the cavalry reacted faster. They had just mounted their horses when they were surrounded by at least 3 or 4 scouts. After a round of wild attacks, they were injured and fell off their horses. Yenda was responsible for leading a company of scouts to deal with the sleeping Tatar cavalry. Even though Yenda only had 100 soldiers under him, They had attacked suddenly, taking advantage of the element of surprise. By the time Yende launched his attack, most of the enemies were unarmed. The result of this battle was naturally easy for Yende to take down the enemy easily. This battle really wasn't worth writing about. The enemy's strength was weak. If they were strong soldiers, they wouldn't have been assigned to guard a meaningless city. It was another surprise attack. From the beginning to the end of the battle, less than an hour had passed. Of the 500 Tatar cavalrymen, only 4 were killed because of their fierce resistance, and 30 were lightly injured in the resistance. The rest were all alive. Erakamaki had changed hands at this moment. A shining signal flare rose into the sky. Yang Chendong, who was waiting in the distance, led the main army to move towards Erakamaki. From today onwards, the first city that was under construction would become their headquarters in the north. The 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division didn't go with the main army to the future first city. Instead, after a good night's rest, the army suddenly retreated east the next morning, heading towards the newer Gondusi region. They had a new mission to open up a new logistical supply line. If anyone dared to threaten them on this road, they would end up dead under their spears and swords. Erakamaki had changed hands. The delay in the news and the fact that none of the 500 Tatar cavalry had a chance to escape caused this news to be completely sealed and not spread. Outside the city, the Tatar team sent out to pull water appeared. At that time, the grassland was still very rich in water plants. There was no environmental pollution, and because of the small population, it was not wantonly exploited. In fact, there was no shortage of water sources. It was just that the spring water in Erakamaki's city was better and more delicious. Therefore, some Tatar nobles were still very used to drinking the water here, and there was a matter of fetching water once every half a month. Not only was the water quality of the spring good, but the amount of water was also sufficient. No one knew where it was connected to, but it gave people a feeling of inexhaustible. Every time the caravan that came to fetch water became very large. Looking at the place where the independent regiment was lying in ambush, the number of caravans was more than 200. Could be said to be majestic like a long dragon. Wow, what a huge team. Using binoculars, Tiger Mane saw the approaching caravan from afar and sighed. At the same time, his eyes were shining. He was afraid that there would not be many people coming. If that was the case, there would be no meaning in fighting. Reporting to Commander, the scouts report that the enemy has a total of 200 carriages, 5,000 civilians and about 1,000 cavalry. Deputy Commander Xin Honghai lowered his voice and came to Tiger Mane's side to report. Xin Honghai, the deputy commander of the independent regiment, was from Chichen City. He had been an auxiliary soldier, cold front squad leader, platoon leader and company commander. Later, because of his courage and calmness, he was chosen by Yang Chendong and transferred to the independent regiment to assist Tiger Mane in his daily work. Because of Tiger Mane's multiple identities, when he was not around, Xin Honghai was mainly responsible for the regiment's work. Only 1,000 cavalry? Tiger Mane, who was originally eager to give it a try, was like a deflated balloon. His fighting spirit was reduced by half in an instant. He originally thought that it would be the enemy cavalry, but he did not expect that there would be 5,000 civilians. In this way, this battle really did not have much of a start. If they were not evenly matched, it would not show the strength of the independent regiment, right? This was the difference between mercenaries and other armies. Other people were afraid that the opponent was too strong and would be dangerous when fighting. However, when it came to mercenaries, they despised the opponent for being too one-sided. It would not be satisfying to fight and it would not show their strength. With only 1,000 cavalry opponents, Tiger Mane felt dispirited. When he looked at Xin Honghai, who was unusually excited, he decided to do him a favor. All right, Deputy Commander Xin, the command of this battle will be handed over to you. But remember, the 5,000 civilians cannot be hurt. Young Master wants to build Shur City, so he needs a lot of manpower. These are all good laborers. Understood, please rest assured, Commander. Xin Honghai patted his chest and said with a face full of assurance. Then he turned around and left as if he was afraid that Tiger Mane would change his mind if he stayed any longer. Tiger Mane was Yang Chendong's subordinate, so naturally he did not have to worry about being promoted. Xin Honghai had relied on his own hard work and ability to get to where he was today. Although he was only in his early 20s and could be considered a relatively young deputy commander, since he was born in the cold front, the world in his heart was much bigger than that of ordinary people. His dreams were also much broader. After receiving the military order, Xin Honghai immediately called over the 10 battalion commanders who had just been reorganized from infantry to cavalry. Commander has already handed the battle mission to me. Now I order each battalion to send out 100 cavalrymen to attack the enemy's cavalry with me. The other cavalrymen will be responsible for guarding the 5,000 civilians pulling the water wheel. Since the enemy only had 1,000 cavalrymen in order to train the ability of his subordinates, he naturally would not send out too many cavalrymen. Only when the number of soldiers was equal could it be a form of training. A battalion had 400 people, but only 100 of them could go out. This made the 10 battalion commanders somewhat unhappy. 2 of the young and energetic battalion commanders clamored that they would send out their own battalion to ensure that they could deal with the enemy's 1,000 cavalrymen. Chapter 696. It was naturally a good thing for the officers to have strong confidence. However, this wasn't the time to flaunt their heroism. How could Xin Honghai agree to this? With one sentence, if anyone dared to speak out of turn, even the mission of 100 men would be cancelled. Sure enough, the battalion commanders became well-behaved. So be it, it was better than not sending anyone. The battalion commanders followed Xin Honghai's instructions with the idea of training their fighting spirit through actual combat. They picked out a group of 100 men with average strength and gathered a total of 1,000 men to hand over to the deputy commander. What was worth mentioning was that the officer leading each battalion was actually a battalion commander, and all of them held official positions. Xin Honghai naturally noticed this scene, but he didn't say anything. The officers below also wanted to go on the battlefield and kill the enemy. He naturally couldn't refuse. After all, wasn't he also leading the troops? The caravan in the distance was getting closer and closer. It could already be seen that the 5,000 men driving the caravan were all dejected and dispirited. Even the 1,000 cavalrymen were walking sparsely. There wasn't the slightest bit of vigilance and formation that a cavalry troop should have. Although it could be said that the grasslands were currently in chaos, there was war everywhere. Many people were still fine when they left home in the morning, but who knew if this would be the last time they left home? However, in the face of danger, no one would have the idea of taking the water caravan. It was simply too worthless. It was too much of a loss to pay the price for these things. Even the common people knew that they shouldn't do things that were unprofitable, let alone a cavalry troop. Therefore, when the independent regiment suddenly appeared and Xin Honghai led 1,000 cavalrymen to kill from the side, the 1,000 Tatar cavalrymen looked at them as if they hadn't woken up from a dream. They looked at them as if they were looking at an idiot. It was as if they were saying, "Are you kidding me? We're just a caravan. You want to steal from us? Enemy. The leading Tatar Chiliarch only stared blankly for a moment before he reacted. He then pulled out his saber and shouted loudly. He intended to summon the morale of the army back in the shortest time possible. Kill. At this moment, Xin Honghai and his 1,000 cavalrymen were already less than 150 meters away from the Tatar cavalrymen. As the general leading the team, he shouted as he took out his bow and shot an arrow at the nearest target. He didn't use a flintlock because Xin Honghai didn't think it was necessary. Since they were cavalrymen, archery was still the best choice for long-range weapons. This was also a form of training for the troops. Following Xin Honghai's arrow, the countless independent cavalry around him also knocked their bows and shot forward. Dozens of Tatar cavalrymen had nowhere to hide and were hit by the arrows and fell from their horses. However, even more of the Tatar cavalry managed to escape with the speed of their horses. At the same time, they began to shoot arrows, threatening and killing the opposing cavalry. The cavalry of the independent regiment was made up of the original auxiliary soldiers and the captive soldiers of the Ming army of Nuergan Dusi. Among them, it wasn't that they didn't have horse riding skills in the past. They were just ordinary soldiers who hadn't undergone strict training. For an army like this, even if they were given healthy horses, it would still be difficult for them to display the true advantage of cavalry. Because of this, the weakness of the independent regiment was revealed when they shot arrows. Facing the Tatar cavalrymen who grew up on horseback, both sides shot at each other. After a short while, the unprepared Tatar cavalryman began to gain the upper hand. Out of the corner of his eyes, he saw his own soldiers being shot by arrows or falling off their horses. In a short period of time about 100 people were injured or died in battle. Xin Honghai clenched his teeth in heartache. He finally realized that his cavalry was still lacking in many aspects. No, we can't go on like this. A voice sounded in his mind. Xin Honghai was very clear about the strength of his cavalry. Most of them were like ducks being forced to perch on a perch. They lacked the time to break in with their horses and the time to train on horseback. Especially when it came to archery. Whether it was shooting moving targets or moving arrows, they were still very weak. It was expected that cavalry would be at a disadvantage when shooting at each other. Rome wasn't built in a day. Powerful military combat ability wasn't something that could be trained in a single battle. In order to reduce losses, the soldiers had to have more opportunities to train and survive. Xian Honghai made a decision. He shouted loudly, "All battalion commanders charge with me. Close combat." With Xin Honghai as the leader, he brought 10 battle-hardened battalion commanders to close in on the Tatar cavalrymen from all directions. Under their lead, more and more soldiers stopped taking out their bows and followed behind the officer. They dodged the arrows and closed in on the enemy cavalrymen. Tiger's Mane was looking at everything that was happening in the distance through his binoculars. His expression was stern. When the 6th young master said that he wanted to give this mission to them to train and strengthen the ability of the independent regiment to fight on horseback, he was still a little unconvinced. Previously, their independent regiment had used infantry to defeat cavalry at the short stone pile. Now that they were cavalry, how could they not defeat cavalry? Reality gave Tiger's Mane a big slap in the face. Only now did he understand that their previous victory was only due to the power of the Type 81 assault rifle. When they gave up on using firearms, their independent regiment was nothing. "Commander, the situation with Vice Commander Xian is not good. Should we send the cavalry battalion?" Another cavalry battalion commander of the independent regiment asked worriedly. The independent regiment had 10 cavalry battalions that were reorganized from infantry. Apart from them, there were 6 other cavalry regiments. In comparison, these 6 cavalry regiments were much stronger. Although they couldn't compare to the Nuzan cavalry, they had the advantage of numbers. Dealing with 1,000 Tatar cavalrymen wasn't a problem. Clenching his right fist, Tiger's Mane was a little tempted. His breathing became a little heavier. But after a while he exhaled and said, "No need. An army has to go through hardships and risks in the end. If they are always under protection, this kind of army will never be strong." Tiger's Mane didn't order the main force to go out and help. This was because he knew that an army that hadn't undergone a transformation wasn't a strong army. It was also because he believed in his vice commander Xin Honghai. He believed that he would be able to obtain the final victory. Not letting Tiger's Mane down, Xin Honghai really did give up on long-range attacks when he discovered that the situation wasn't good. He changed to close combat. He relied on the incomparably sharp saber in his hand to shorten the gap between the two sides. When Xin Honghai brought his 10 battalion commanders to the front of the Tatar cavalry, the saber in his hand continuously swung down. The enemy's cavalry formation that had just gathered was scattered. The advantage of archery was suppressed. Taking advantage of this opportunity, more and more of the independent regiment's cavalry rushed over. The situation began to turn in their favor. The soldiers of the independent regiment couldn't be more familiar with the saber training. When they didn't have war horses, one of the things they had to do every day was to hack their saber 1,000 times a day. Because of this, countless soldiers' right arms swelled up. Some even fainted on the training ground. Their hard work finally paid off. Under the supervision and urging of their commander Tiger's Mane, Vice Commander Xin Honghai and other officers, the soldiers swung their sabers quickly and powerfully. Now that they had changed to close combat, their hard work finally paid off. Ding ding dang dang. The sound of metal colliding rang out. Weapons collided with weapons, and the two sides that were previously suppressed entered a stalemate. This stalemate didn't last long. As the sabers continued to collide, cracks began to appear on the sabers of the Tatar cavalry. The quality of the weapons became the biggest factor that affected the outcome of the battle. Finally, after 7 or 8 clashes, the sabers in the hands of the Tatar cavalry began to break more and more. Both sides were riding horses, both were cavalry, and both sides were moving at the same speed. One side had weapons while the other side only had a broken saber that couldn't threaten the life of the other side. The result was already predetermined. Retreat. Seeing the sabers in their hands break one after another, the arrogant Tatar cavalry's expression changed greatly. They turned around and fled. They had already seen 200 water carts and 5,000 civilians being controlled by the enemy. Knowing that the difference in numbers was too great, they finally decided to retreat. They had to inform the generals of this news. The Tatar cavalry fled. They used horse riding skills that were more skillful than the independent regiment's cavalry to escape. All that was left for Xin Honghai and the others were the horses' tails and the backs of the Tatar cavalry. Although the Tatar cavalry fled and the independent regiment seemed to have won, when the final statistics were tallied, they discovered that they had lost more than 100 soldiers and more than 300 were injured. However, the number of enemy cavalry that remained was less than 200. This was the first time since the establishment of the mercenary regiment that they had such a ratio of battle results and casualties. Of course, this was the first time that the results were the worst. Because of this, Xin Honghai brought 10 battalion commanders and more than 800 cavalrymen, who were either injured or uninjured, to the commander of Tiger Brilliance and asked for forgiveness. You don't need to ask for forgiveness from me. You should ask for forgiveness from the more than 100 comrades that have already died. With the same number of soldiers, you suddenly killed your way out and took the initiative. However, the battle was actually so tragic. You can conclude it yourselves. Tiger's man said with a cold face. After saying this, he brought the 200 water carts and the 5,000 civilians that he had just captured and headed to the beginning city. As the commander of the independent regiment, he had to bear the main responsibility for today's battle. He had to personally ask for forgiveness in front of the 6th young master. Aramadki had been officially renamed as the beginning city by Yang Chendong. After the name change, the city seemed to be glowing with youth. The city was bustling with activity. Chapter 697. Under Yang Chendong's orders, a large number of trees and stones were carried into the city. Temporary houses were either reinforced or uprooted from the ground. Since they were going to choose this place as their base camp, they naturally had to build a place for the army to live. Rows of brave cavalrymen dismounted from their war horses and became construction workers to build their own homes. Not only them but the thousands of people in the city were also busy. Among them, except for the children, everyone else joined the army to build the city. The old men and young men worked with the mercenary soldiers and could earn 1 or 2 taels of silver every day. This was naturally a great temptation for them. Even the women entered the logistics camp to help cook. In this way, not only could they eat 3 meals in the army, but they could also earn half a tael of silver a day. This was an unprecedented good thing. For the thousands of people in the city, silver was a very distant thing. They almost did not have an impression of it. The daily necessities were the men hunting and the women mending clothes. They were barely able to survive and not starve to death. But now, the appearance of the mercenary army gave them new hope. They were already fantasizing that with enough silver one day, they could buy the good things that they had always wanted to buy but did not dare to buy. Perhaps when that day came, they would also be able to live a decent life. Yang Chendong had never lacked silver. The creativity of Crimson City had surpassed any force. The Outer Heaven Trading Company had also become the richest trading company in the world. The rare goods from their hands had now been circulated to the 5 continents and 8 places. Even among some unfriendly forces, they did not openly exclude Xianxia's goods. After all, there were some things that even the aristocrats and royalty liked. Once they were openly excluded, they would no longer be able to get the goods that they liked and the items that could make their quality of life reach a higher standard. As the saying went, it was easy to do things with silver. Yang Chendong firmly believed that when a large sum of silver was spent, it would attract more people to come to the beginning city, either to work or to settle here. It would not be long before this place would become a big city, a strong city. Since it was called First City, Yang Chendong had a certain idea and hope in his heart. He wanted to build this city into one of the largest cities in the vicinity. In order to achieve this goal, he had to expand the original area of the city to more than 10 times its original size. This required an astronomical number of workers. Just as he was thinking about the lack of manpower, Tiger's mane arrived. Yang Chendong laughed heartily when he heard that. Very good. Arrange for them to start working immediately. Oh right, in order to let them put in all their strength to the maximum, you can tell them that if they perform well, not only will they regain their freedom, but they will also be paid several times more than outside. Yang Chendong seemed to be in a good mood. When Tiger's Mane agreed, he took the opportunity to talk about the performance of the independent cavalry on the battlefield. In the end, he even took the initiative to reflect on himself, saying that he had failed in his leadership and asked for punishment. The 10 cavalry battalions that were established after the independent regiment were not trained by Tiger's Mane. They were just ordinary soldiers from the Baiming Guards. In terms of military quality, they could only be said to be average. If not for the fact that he did not want to reveal his identity and whereabouts at that time, he was afraid that these people would have been released at that time. However, since they had stayed for such a long time, and after they understood the situation of the mercenaries, they also wanted to join. Yang Chendong naturally could not refuse. This gave them the opportunity to enlist in the army, and even become a glorious cavalry. However, a weak foundation was a weak foundation. This was an indisputable fact. This battle had already exposed too many of their weaknesses and shortcomings. Normally, if it were any other general, they would have given up on this kind of army. After all, training a qualified cavalry required a lot of energy and financial resources. Even training an excellent cavalry required more time and effort than training 5 infantrymen. However, since they were fated to join the mercenary army, Yang Chendong couldn't just leave them be, based on the principle of not giving up on them. After thinking for a while, he took the initiative to say, "How about this? I will give you a month. In this month, unless the situation is urgent, I will not arrange any combat missions for these 10 battalions. After a month there will be an assessment. Those who pass can stay, and those who do not pass will be given a toll to leave the army." No matter what, these cavalry soldiers were still Han disciples. Just based on this point, Yang Chendong was worthy of giving them a chance. Tiger's Mane was originally worried that the 6th young master would be angry at their failure to fight and directly dismiss the soldiers who had just become cavalry soldiers. After all, in the army, survival of the fittest was too common. If that was the case, as the commander of the independent regiment, he could not say anything. Fortunately, the 6th young master still remembered their old friendship and promised to give his brothers a chance to become stronger. He immediately respectfully saluted. "Thank you, young master. I thank you on behalf of the 4,000 brothers." Seeing that Tiger's Mane was sincerely thanking him, Yang Chendong's expression turned serious and said, "What I want is not gratitude. I want them to stay after a month." Yes. Tiger's Mane saluted again and decided by vote. The order was passed to the army. When the 10 new cavalry battalions of the independent regiment heard the final decision of the 6th young master, many people's eyes were bloodshot. They knew that the best and possibly the last opportunity in their lives had come. An opportunity that could change their lives had come. Perhaps in the past their abilities were really ordinary or could even be described as very weak. But that was only because of the military rules. In that kind of environment where everyone was just muddling along, even if you wanted to show off, there was no chance, let alone any conditions. Think about it, an army that could barely fill their stomachs. What kind of strong combat power could they rely on? But now their eating, drinking, and pooping were not a problem. They did not even need to build a city like the 2 reinforced cavalry regiments and the Nuzan cavalry regiment. Instead, they only needed to focus on training. In such an environment, if they still couldn't raise their strength within a month, then they were really trash. They really didn't deserve anyone's sympathy and understanding. Although they still could not be like the Nuzan cavalry regiment in a month's time, they were at least stronger than ordinary cavalry and reached the standard of second-class cavalry. With this belief, the independent regiment went out of the city to train every day at dawn. They would only return when the sky was completely dark and they could not see. Then, after dragging their tired bodies to eat a full meal, they quickly entered the temporary barracks to rest. They trained for at least 12 hours every day, but no one complained about being tired. They were all working hard to change themselves and improve themselves. The independent regiment was changing at an astonishing speed. Just like them, the beginning city was also changing day by day. When the simple barracks were built, Yang Chendong gave another order. Some of the old houses in the city were demolished one after another. The stones and wood that were taken down were used to build the outer city wall. In Yang Chendong's eyes, most of the original buildings in the city were not up to standard. Not only were their houses built simply and not sturdy enough, but even the layout was too messy. The streets were too narrow and there was no planning. No matter how big the territory of such a city was and how many people it had it still gave people the feeling that it was extremely backward. Since the city was named by him, it had to look like a big city. For a time, the city began to become empty. More and more uninhabited houses in the city were demolished to build the big city wall. In this manner, after merely 10 days had passed, there was an additional solid outer city that was 6 to 7 miles long outside of the beginning city. Looking from afar, it had a trace of majestic appearance, and the embryonic form of a large city was beginning to appear. The movement in the beginning city naturally attracted the attention of the other forces in the surrounding area. This was especially true for the nearby Tatars. Originally, the first city belonged to them. Now, not only was it occupied by someone else, the 5,000 commoners who were sent to fetch water were also snatched away by someone else. Out of the 1,000 cavalrymen that were sent out, about 200 of them had died. This was already considered hatred. It was a kind of hatred that had to be avenged. Not only the Tatar army, even Haruochu of the Wara, who had suffered a loss at the hands of Yang Chendong, had also sent out scouts to inquire about them after losing the battle. The movement in the beginning city was big enough. Of course, it had attracted their attention. For a time they were eager to give it a try. In addition, there were also the Mongolian tribes in the Gobi Desert. Khan Sud suffered a great loss at the hands of Yang Chendong. When he returned to the tribe, he was also criticized. This made him feel ashamed. At this time, the scouts sent back news that they had found the 5-star army that had once caused them a loss. They were building the beginning city. But at the same time, there was another piece of news. That was, the 5-star army was actually a mercenary army. Their leader was the war god of the Great Ming Dynasty who had defeated the leader of the Wala, Yeshen. He was the Great Ming Dynasty's Duke of Loyalty, Yang Chendong. The 5-star army was a mercenary army. The army that was building the beginning city was a mercenary army. When this news was intentionally released by Yang Chendong, it quickly shocked the area. Some of the forces that were originally eager to make a move couldn't help but suppress the idea of making a move. They decided to wait and see first. Who was Yeshen? Presumably, there was no one in the grassland who didn't know about him. In the coup 3 years ago, this person defeated the Great Ming Dynasty's hundreds of thousands of main forces. At one point he almost breached the capital of the Great Ming Dynasty. How glorious was that? However, such a powerful person with a powerful cavalry team was still defeated by a Han scholar in his early 20s. After the war, this person also received an even more resounding nickname, War God. Chapter 698. This battle caused the name of the god of war to resound throughout the Mongolian grasslands. This made many people want to get to know this person better. Now this person had appeared on the grasslands and was in front of them. As the saying went, a person's name was like a tree's shadow. After he announced his name, who knew how many Mongolian soldiers were afraid? They had no choice but to withdraw their evil claws. They wanted to take a look first. The construction of the first city was still in full swing. When Yang Chendong intentionally asked the reconnaissance camp to release the news that the mercenary army would purchase a large amount of wood and a large number of stones needed for the construction of the city, they would purchase them at a price 10% higher than the market price as long as they were sent to the first city and the materials were suitable. More and more nearby merchants had come here to do business. More and more materials were sent in from all directions, and the construction speed of the city began to increase. More and more people came to work here, freeing up a large number of mercenaries. However, the construction speed did not slow down. After 20 days, the outer city walls had begun to take shape. Looking from afar, it looked majestic. What was even more surprising was that no army had come to find trouble or attack this place after such a big move, which was tantamount to snatching meat from the mouths of others. This could be said to be a miracle. However, only Yang Chendong knew that this was only because of his name as the god of war and the strength of the mercenaries. This fear was only temporary. Once the 3 divisions of the Lungfeng division moved large amounts of resources into the city, and once he had a supply line and trade route from the first city to High Town, under the temptation of great benefits, there would be people who could not resist the temptation to attack. As for when that day would come, it all depended on when the 3 divisions of the Lungfeng division returned. At this time, the 3 divisions of the Lungfeng division had already walked past the Daxing and Mountain and came to the Liao River. They were heading towards the Jianzhou left guard by the Songhua River. At this time, the Jianzhou left guard was not the same as before. First, the 2,000 cavalrymen led by Zhou Xian and Wei Zhen were destroyed. Then Tang Longtian led 2,000 infantrymen and disappeared by the Liao River. Their strength had been greatly reduced. For this matter, the commander of the Imperial Guard, Agila, sent someone to ask for help from the general of the newer Gan Du Si, who was also the Du Si commander Song Quan. The people had been sent out, but it would take some time to get a result. It was at this moment that the 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division suddenly appeared in the vicinity of the Jianzhou left guard. When they heard the news from their scouts that an unknown but massive army was passing through their territory, how could they not be alarmed? Ever since Commander Zhou Xian was informed of the incident, Abdullah had sent many people to investigate the situation. At one point, the incident had even alerted the embroidered uniform guards stationed in the new Gandusi region. It had to be said that this organization was very capable. After they began to pay attention to this matter and sent people out, the news quickly spread that this incident was most likely done by the 5-Star Army. The 5-Star Army's actions in the newer Gandusi region were indeed very low-key. Perhaps many people didn't take them seriously. However, what did the embroidered uniform guards do for a living? They were good at grasping details. When they were certain of something, they could even fabricate details if there weren't any. Not to mention the 5-Star Army had thousands of brothers. They had long taken note of such a force, but they didn't pay attention to the high level. After visiting, the embroidered uniform guards first locked onto Ding Shan, who had made a deal with the vice-chiliarch of the Twin Cities Guard, Zhang Mingji. After drawing a sketch of this person and comparing it, the name of the 5-Star Army's reconnaissance company commander came out. Everything was settled. After the incident was reported, the 5-Star Army became the main opponent of the Baiming Guard's army. They were an existence that everyone wanted to kill. However, for some reason the target suddenly disappeared. It was as if they had evaporated from the world. They couldn't find their location. Speaking of which, since they couldn't find the 5-Star Army, they could only continue to investigate. At this moment, the 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division appeared. They didn't have the slightest intention of hiding and walked out openly. Not only that, but they even headed straight for the Jianzhou left guard's base. Their target was so clear that it gave the guard commander Abdullah a fright. Abdullah ordered his men to close the city gate, which wasn't too tall or too big, while gathering more than 1,600 infantrymen. He personally went up the city gate tower and watched the army slowly approaching from afar. Cold sweat kept dripping down his forehead. As mentioned before, Abdullah was good at fighting. He had relied on his own abilities to reach his position. It was precisely because of this that he was different from those who had inherited their official positions. He had a more precise ability to judge and analyze the battlefield. When he saw the 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division approaching from afar, his intuition told him that if both sides were to fight, he wouldn't be a match for them. At the thought of this, more cold sweat dripped down his forehead. He thought to himself, "What's going on? Why did a force that didn't belong to us suddenly appear? How come I didn't know about it at all?" The 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division didn't advance slowly. They were all cavalrymen, so they could maintain their speed to the greatest extent. In addition, Yang Chendong had ordered them to make a big fuss, so they didn't have to hide anything along the way. Their speed became faster and faster. The army that was still far away soon arrived at the foot of the Jianzhou left guard city. The 2nd Regiment, which was in charge of the vanguard, also arrived at the foot of the city and began to get into formation. Qin Bo, who was the regiment commander and the political commissar of the 3 divisions, was the first to leap out of his horse. When he looked up, he saw Abdullah looking at him from top to bottom. The 2 people's gazes met at this moment. After about a breath of time, Qin Bo took a loudspeaker that could be used as a loudspeaker and began to loudly shout, "The generals on the city walls and the soldiers of northern Ming, listen up. I am an officer of the mercenary army under the command of the Duke of Loyal and Bold of the Great Ming. This time I came from afar without the slightest bit of malice. I just want to borrow your path. As long as you don't act rashly, your safety can be guaranteed." Qin Bo stopped after shouting this sentence twice. Under his signal, a bow and arrow carrying a letter was shot up the city wall tower and landed at Abdullah's feet. The Great Ming Dynasty's Duke of Loyalty and Courage? Abdullah muttered something under his breath as he picked up the bow and arrow that had fallen to the ground. He then opened the letter and read it. The contents of the letter were even more detailed and confirmed what Qin Bo had said earlier. When the great Ming dynasty's Duke of Loyalty and Courage heard that the Walla in the north intended to invade the border, he had already arrived at the grasslands in the north. He wanted to build a rear base called Shur City there. However, considering the shortage of supplies, he needed a sufficiently safe logistical path. Thus he chose the newer Gondusi area. The Jianzhou left guard city's defensive position happened to be on the chosen supply route. The introduction in the letter was quite detailed. It explained the cause and effect of the matter very clearly and also expressed a certain degree of goodwill. In other words, they were only borrowing the route and did not have the slightest intention of staying in the newer Gondusi area or occupying a territory. They also asked for the other party's cooperation. Of course, if the other party had any ideas, but it was not impossible for them to fight. At the end of the letter, Yang Qindong also said that the Han people in the world were originally one family. This time he was helping the Han people to deal with the foreign tribes in the north. However, if someone dared to play any tricks behind his back, he did not mind taking action to deal with the foreign forces first. By then, whoever wanted to use the mercenaries would have to pay 10 times, 100 times or even 1,000 times the price. The great Ming dynasty's Duke of Loyalty and Courage was nicknamed the God of War. Not to mention, during the year that this person went to the south, he had successively defeated the troublemaking Huang bandit army and destroyed Jiaoji and Kanglan nations. This was something that even the great Ming dynasty could not do. Now that Yang Qindong had done it, how could such a person be easy to deal with? Now that this person had appeared in his line of sight, Abdullah already had the feeling that he was no match for this person even before the battle started. Then again, he was only a commander of the Imperial Guard and his authority was limited. Such a major matter was not something that he could make the decision on. He still needed to seek instructions from the higher-ups and listen to their arrangements. Abdullah did not want to offend the other party, so he quickly replied, "General, this matter is of great importance. Please allow me to seek instructions from the higher-ups before making a decision. Of course, to express our goodwill, we will do our best to provide you with food during the few days that you are waiting. Is that all right?" The supplies needed to be prepared and shipped from Xi'an City to Hai Town. It would take some time for them to be shipped by sea. What the Leng Feng's 3 divisions had the most now was time. What they needed to do was to make use of this free time to build up their invincible influence. Therefore, it did not matter where they stopped as long as they could intimidate the enemy. "Alright, we agree. General, please make the application to the higher-ups as soon as possible." Qin Bo agreed on behalf of the 3 divisions. With a wave of his hand, the cavalrymen dismounted and began to set up camp 5 miles in front of Jian Province's left guard. Abdullah returned to the barracks from the city tower and immediately wrote an urgent letter. He then ordered his trusted aide to deliver it to the city where the commander was stationed. After that, he arranged for the soldiers in the barracks to send some extra food to the foot of the city in baskets. Speaking of which, after losing 2,000 cavalrymen and 2,000 infantrymen, they still had a lot of food left. The Leng Feng's 3 divisions did not hold back and arranged for their soldiers to receive the food at the foot of the city. They did not seem to be on guard at all, which showed that they had no ulterior motives. This made Abdullah feel more at ease. The fact that the other party was willing to accept the food meant that they were expressing their goodwill. In this case, the other party should not attack anymore. Otherwise, why would they go through so much trouble? Chapter 699. Food was sent out on time every day, and Abdullah would go up to the city tower to check on the situation. Not only him but all the soldiers in the guard station were also paying close attention to the army below the city. As time went by, even the Baiming citizens in the city would use their connections to go up to the city tower just to see the army under the Duke of Loyalty's command. Everyone was shocked by what they saw. No one knew if it was intentional or not, but the next morning, the 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division began their military training and drills. The 3 divisions of the Cold Front Division had been expanded after the Battle of Liao River, and some of them were former soldiers of the Baiming Guard Station. They formed the 4th and 5th Battalions of the Cold Front Division with the veterans of the Cold Front Division. In other words, the 4th and 5th Battalions of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Regiments were all recruit battalions, and their combat strength was relatively weak. However, this was only in comparison. If they were to fight against the Nuzan cavalry, they would not lose out. There were a total of 6 battalions, and because they were newly formed, their combat strength was not up to the overall standard of the Cold Front Division. In order to let them catch up in time, Division Commander Wu Sheng and Political Commissar Chen Bo purposely increased the intensity and standard of their training. Now that they had time to stay below the city, of course they would not abandon their training. Not only that, they also increased the intensity of their training. Every day at dawn, the soldiers of the 6 battalions would get out of bed, run a few laps around the camp, and only stop when they had covered a distance of 10 kilometers. Then they would practice slashing with their swords, and each person would slash at least 200 times. When they were done, it was time for breakfast. Only then did the soldiers have half an hour to rest. After breakfast, the training continued. Each person would slash 200 times, and then it was target practice. Of course, considering the amount of ammunition they had, it was impossible for them to use live ammunition right away. First, they had to practice various postures. For example, one person would have to practice for 2 hours to raise the gun. They also had to hang a heavy stone under the butt of the gun to practice their stability and so on. In the afternoon, it was time for cavalry training. Getting on the horse to slash, getting on the horse to raise the spear and so on. At night, there would be an hour of sparring practice. The warriors would put on all kinds of armor and then fight with wooden sabers. It was common for them to bleed and get injured. After an hour, it would be a day and a half of rest and study time. At least half an hour of learning, including various maps, hand gestures, and other skills, before they could sleep for the day. At this time, the soldiers would start snoring after entering their tents. There were even sounds of teeth grinding, farting, and so on. However, no one blamed the other comrades because everyone was very tired. It could be said that they fell asleep as soon as they touched the pillow. Again and again, every day was the same training. All of this fell into the eyes of the beaming army generals and common people on the city gate tower. Abdullah had sighed in his heart more than once. This is a strong army. Their training methods are very scientific. They definitely won't be able to stop such an army. Not to mention that he only had a little over 1,000 infantrymen. Even if he was given 10,000 or 50,000 men, he would not think that he could defeat such a powerful enemy. Hopefully Shangguan will agree to open up a path for them. It's definitely a nightmare to be enemies with such people. General Abdullah sighed in his heart as he anxiously waited for Shangguan's reply. This wait lasted for 10 days. Finally, a cavalry scout came from afar with a letter in his arms. It represented the attitude of the new Ergon city toward the mercenaries. Whether they would fight or cooperate, the result would be clear soon. Abdullah received the letter from the scout with a nervous heart. He opened it silently. His expression changed rapidly. His brows were furrowed and relaxed at times. The letter was written by the city's commander, Song Quan. According to the letter, the embroidered uniform guard had already determined that the 5-star army was part of the mercenaries. In other words, the horse robbery that happened here, including the Liao River incident, should be the work of the mercenaries. Come to think of it, this was probably the only army in the world that could eliminate more than 10,000 enemies without leaving any traces or evidence behind. The letter also said that since the mercenaries provoked them first, it would not be a problem for them to retaliate appropriately. Considering the strength of the mercenaries, the lack of orders from the higher-ups, and the fact that Yang Qindong was a loyal duke recognized by the Great Ming Dynasty, they only needed to retaliate appropriately and did not need to go all out. Abdullah heaved a sigh of relief when he read this. He no longer considered what the mercenaries had done to them. His observations over the past few days told him that the mercenaries were not to be trifled with, not at all. The contents of the letter made Abdullah feel even more relieved. Considering the current situation of the Jian province left guard, the higher-ups would not send them into battle personally. It was not just the Jian province left guard. Even the larger Jian province guard and Shenyang central guard did not have any cavalry, so they did not need to use them. This time, the higher-ups would directly send 3,000 cavalrymen to test the mercenaries' capabilities. What Abdullah needed to do was to stand below the city gate tower and record everything that happened from the beginning to the end of the battle in detail. He could then report it truthfully when he returned. After reading the letter, Abdullah had mixed feelings. The higher-ups were not willing to let the mercenaries off easily. They wanted to be selective and test them appropriately. However, was this necessary? Perhaps 10 days ago, when the 3 Lingfeng division masters had just arrived, Abdullah also had the same thought. However, after watching the mercenaries training for 10 days, especially after watching the 3 division's 9 Lingfeng division battalions train, he had long given up on such thoughts. The 9 battalions were quiet, but when they moved like flood dragons. Not only were their horsemanship superb, but they also practiced chopping 500 times in a row. Not only were there sufficient numbers, but their speed was also very fast. He had seen with his own eyes the wooden stakes that had been set up to act as imaginary enemies being split in half in a very short period of time. That saber seems different too. Sharper and tougher than ours. Abdullah could not help but sigh as he thought about it. Then he began to look forward to the outcome of the 3,000 cavalrymen sent by the higher-ups. He also wanted to encourage his own cavalry, but for some reason he could not muster up the strength to do so. In the military camp outside the city, Division Master Wu Sheng had just returned from his chopping training. Compared to the ordinary Lingfeng warriors, he had set himself a requirement of 600 slashes in a row. While he had to make an extra 100 slashes, the time requirement was the same. In other words, if the warriors could make 500 slashes in the same amount of time, he would have to make 600 slashes to qualify. As the Lingfeng warriors' military quality continued to improve, as the division master, Wu Sheng's expectations of himself became higher and higher. He returned covered in sweat. As soon as he received a towel from the correspondent, Political Commissar Chen Bo appeared in front of him. Division Master, the Baiming Division has already sent someone back to the city. They should have received some news. However, the other party has no intention of contacting us. It seems like the news is not necessarily good. I'm afraid we'll have to fight. The moment Chen Bo entered the room, he took a towel from the correspondent behind him and wiped his face. It was obvious that he was also covered in sweat. It was obvious that he had just finished his training. Let's fight then. If we don't fight, some people won't know how powerful we are. The warriors below have been holding back for a long time. It's a good opportunity for them to vent their frustrations, Wu Xing said nonchalantly. His face was filled with fighting spirit and confidence. All right, let's wait and see. Chen Bo said unhurriedly. In their eyes, the Baiming Division's cavalrymen were nothing. Even though they knew that a big battle was coming, they were not nervous at all. They did not even need to prepare. This was because the 3 divisions of the Lingfeng Division had always been on the first level of combat readiness. They were ready to fight at any time. Being unprepared was the best preparation. This was a strong confidence in one's own strength. 3 days later in the morning, from the northeast of the 3 divisions' barracks, a cavalry troop that seemed to cover the sky and earth came from afar. They left a trail of dust behind them. They're here. Division Commander Wu Sheng and Political Commissar Chen Bo, who were still instructing the troops to practice shooting, immediately reacted. The troops immediately gathered, mounted their horses and carried their swords. They were eager to fight. As soon as the troops gathered, a scout rushed back and rushed in front of the division commander and political commissar. Reporting to the chief. It's the Baiming Division's cavalrymen. There are about 3,000 of them. 3,000? After hearing this, Wu Xing shook his head with some disinterest. 3,000 is really too little. That's right. It's a little too little. This time, even political commissar Chen Bo agreed. However, they did not know that if their opponents heard these words, they would be enraged. They had seen people look down on others, but they had never seen people look down on others like this. The 2 division commanders looked at each other and smiled helplessly. They said at the same time, "Who do you think we should send?" They said the words at the same time. Then the 2 looked at each other and smiled. They were prepared to fight personally, but the enemy only had 3,000 men. To be honest, it was too little. It was so little that they were embarrassed to fight with their subordinates. They both understood each other's thoughts. In the end, political commissar Chen Bo said, "Then let's rest for a while. We have to give the soldiers who came later a chance to show off. Why don't we send the 3rd commander to lead the 6 battalions? 6 battalions against 3,000 cavalrymen. That's reasonable." Wu Xing thought about it carefully and nodded in agreement. 6 battalions meant that each battalion had 400 men, which was 2,400 men. Although these people were not enough to deal with the enemy's 3,000 cavalrymen to Lungfeng, this was already bullying. The 6 battalions were formed later, so their overall strength was slightly weaker. If it was the elite Cold Front Division, 3 battalions would be enough. Chapter 700. After the two division commanders came to a decision, they called the 3rd Regiment Commander, Spring Sun, over and passed on the order. Regiment Commander Spring, this performance will directly affect whether our supply route will be smooth in the future. It will directly affect the future plans of the 6th Young Master. This is extremely important. Are you confident that you can complete this mission? Qin Bo said as soon as he saw Spring Sunday Division Commander Wu Sheng's words were even more direct. Spring Sun, if you can complete this mission then accept it. If not, then go back to your 3rd regiment. I can't wait to do it myself. Hey, what are you two talking about? You can look down on me, Spring Sun, but you can't look down on the soldiers below. I don't mind making a military pledge here. If this battle can't be fought to our heart's content, if it can't go smoothly, if we can't show the might of our 3rd regiment, then I won't be a regiment commander anymore. I'll just be a cook and take the blame for everyone. Spring Sun said excitedly, even throwing out the military pledge at the first moment. It was no wonder that Spring Sun was so excited. He originally thought that this battle had nothing to do with him. He knew that no matter if it was Division Commander Wu Sheng or Political Commissar Qin Bo, they were both battle-hungry people like him. Plus, they were the regiment commanders of the 1st and 2nd Regiment respectively. There shouldn't be any chance for him to perform in this battle. He didn't think that he who had already given up hope would be hit by this meat pie. He was extremely excited and overjoyed. In order to prevent the mission from being snatched by others, of course he would say whatever he could. With the military pledge, Spring Sun could be considered to have accepted this mission. Next he called the 6 battalion commanders of the newly formed battalions in front of him. Naturally, he gave them another round of encouragement and bold words. The strength of these 6 battalions had greatly increased under the recent training, and they wanted to perform well in a real battle. Now that they had the chance, who wouldn't yell and pat their chest? Immediately, the 6 battalion commanders also made the military pledge. In less than a quarter of an hour, the 6 battalions were ready for battle. At this moment, Wu Sheng and Qin Bo had already led the rest of the Cold Blade warriors to retreat. They left the stage open and gave Chunyang and the other 6 battalions a chance to perform. Everyone listen up. Each person only has a chance to fire 3 bullets. Regardless of whether they hit the target or not, they would charge together with their leader. Don't worry everyone. Bring out the strength you've been training with. It's enough to deal with the enemy. Standing at the front of the group, Chunyang looked at the 6 square formations behind him and shouted in a heroic voice. Kill. 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 Behind him, more than 2,000 people shouted in unison. This voice shook the 9 heavens as if it could shatter the horizon. Above the city gate tower, Abdullah also witnessed the scene before him. When he recognized that the 6 battalions that the mercenaries had sent out were the weakest 6 battalions during the training, he couldn't help but widen his eyes and say, facing a powerful opponent with 3,000 cavalrymen, they sent out the weakest ones. And there were less than 3,000 of them? This mercenaries, where did they get their confidence from? It wasn't just Abdullah. Some of the other Kiliarchs and Baihu standing beside him were also confused. Someone whispered, "This is clearly the mercenaries underestimating the enemy. If that's the case, we'll have a good show to watch." That's right. Your mercenaries may be strong, but if you underestimate the cavalrymen of the Baiming City Guard, you'll have to pay a heavy price. While the crowd on the city gate tower was still discussing, the 3,000 cavalrymen of the Baiming City Guard were getting closer and closer. Their speed was also gradually increasing. It was obvious that the enemy had no intention of stopping. Clearly, they wanted to use this speed to charge in front of the mercenaries and increase the charging force of their cavalrymen. From this point alone, it was clear that the Baiming City Guard had no lack of powerful people. In fact, the leader of this troop was the commandant of the Baiming City Guard, Yi Ligang. He was a major 3rd-grade general and was one of the top 5 figures in the entire Newer Gong City Guard district. If it weren't for the existence of the Imperial Eunuch Supervisor and the Imperial Eunuch Guard, he would be the number 3 figure in the city. How could a person like him not have strength? How could a person like him not know how to lead troops into battle? Everyone slowly increase your speed. When the 2 sides are 2 li apart, charge forward. We need to use our momentum to break the enemy's courage. We need to let the Duke of Loyalty know that mercenaries aren't the only ones who can fight. The cavalrymen of the Baiming City Guard are also unparalleled in the world. Standing in the middle of the troop, Yi Ligong urged his horse forward as he shouted loudly. He was trying his best to motivate the troops before the battle. Kill, kill, kill. The same shout came from the Beiming city guard, but for some reason it didn't sound uniform. It wasn't as heroic and passionate as the previous mercenaries. Facing the charge of the Beiming city guard from afar, Chun Yang didn't move at all. The 6 battalions behind him didn't move either. They stood there like statues, allowing the enemy to approach them step by step. The distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. 5 li, 4 li, 2 li. When they were 2 li apart, Chun Yang's eyes, which were as dark as the abyss, finally regained some spirit. He shouted loudly. Everyone listen to my order. Charge! Charge! The 6 battalions responded in unison. Following that, there was the sound of war horses galloping forward, followed by the sound of soldiers pulling the bolts of their guns. When they were 2 li apart, the Beiming city guard began to increase their speed. They kicked up a cloud of dust as they approached, like a monster that could swallow mountains and rivers. Fire! The cold vanguard soldiers raised their arms as they charged forward. This was the result of their constant training with guns. When the military officer gave the order to open fire, thousands of fireballs shot out at the same time toward the northern Ming dynasty cavalry that was charging at them. Bang! 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 3 bullets were fired one after the other. Before the enemy could react, the bullets whistled through the air and hit the Beiming city guard, causing blood to splatter everywhere. The 3 shots were quickly fired. The soldiers kept the Type 95 on their backs and pulled out their cavalry swords. At this moment, the distance between the two sides was less than 1 li. Next was the bloodiest and most brutal clash between the cavalry swords. The moment when the cavalry collided would always give people a sense of shock. It was like 2 high-speed trains colliding together. The power and destructive power produced would often be very shocking. In such an environment, a person's life would be extremely fragile. An individual's performance would also be minimized. Even a strong person could be smashed to pieces in such a clash. However, even though they knew this common sense and logic from the commander Spring Sun to the warriors in every squad, none of them were afraid. This was because they had been training for a long time. They were waiting for this moment. They were waiting for this moment to show their strength on the battlefield. This was also the glorious moment when they handed in their exam papers. They were waiting for the clash between the two sides. They were waiting for the moment to show their strength in the battle. Some people were even ready to die in the clash. It might be painful, but it might also be very satisfying. After making all the preparations, the 6 battalions of the Cold Vanguard soldiers quickly approached the Beiming city guard. Everyone's eyes were bloodthirsty. At this moment, no one took their lives seriously. There was only one thing in their mind, and that was to kill the enemy again and again. This was a kind of momentum that was unafraid of death. This was a kind of spirit that was fearless. This was a kind of confidence that could only move forward and not retreat. Under this kind of momentum, the 6 battalions still maintained their original formation and continued to move forward. Then there was a flash of cold light. It was like a sharp knife that was about to pierce into the enemy's heart. For this moment, all the soldiers were shouting with all their might. It was as if they didn't do so, they wouldn't be able to increase their strength and vent their powerful momentum. They're about to clash. On the city tower, Abdullah clenched his fists and stared at the scene in front of him. Who was stronger and who was weaker? The answer would be revealed soon. Even though he already knew the answer in his heart, he still hoped that his side would win, even though it seemed impossible. Yes, it was indeed impossible. Just as the two sides were about to collide and were less than 300 meters away from each other, a shocking scene occurred. Like dominoes, the Beiming city guard fell from their horses one after another. In the blink of an eye, over 1,000 men had fallen from their horses. The sudden turn of events caused the originally ambitious General Yi Ligong to turn pale with fright. He suddenly thought of the gunshots he had heard before. Could it be that all of this had happened because of that? Although the newer city guard was located in a remote area, they knew that the mercenaries had continuous fire guns. However, that was all they knew. They knew that the Great Ming Dynasty also had firearms and the Divine Arms Battalion, so they didn't think much of it. It was the same for Yi Ligong when he heard the gunshots just now. He had tried firing firearms on horseback before. When the horses were still, they were still somewhat accurate. However, once the horses moved, they would be firing randomly. The effectiveness of the firearms was very limited. It was precisely because of this experience that he didn't think much of the gunshots. However, he suddenly understood that his brothers who suddenly fell from their horses must have been hit by the firearms. But how could there be so many of them? Yes, there were too many of them. Nearly half of the 3,000 cavalrymen died before they could even get close to the enemy. However, this was not the most important thing. The most important thing was that the casualties were all soldiers, but the war horses were fine. What did this mean? Chapter 701. This meant that the enemy's marksmanship was extremely accurate. Not a single shot hit the ground or hurt the horses. This was a terrifying outcome. If the enemy launched another wave of musket attacks like this, would there still be anyone alive around him? Even if he did, would he be able to survive? At this moment, Yiligong was terrified. He instinctively pulled on the reins. He wanted to see what would happen. He did not want to lose his life here. There were quite a few people who had the same thoughts as Yiligong. They intentionally slowed down and watched as some of their companions charged into the mercenary camp. Boom! Finally, the cavalry from both sides collided. Blood splattered everywhere. Heads were tossed into the air, horses neighed, and corpses fell to the ground. It was only the first charge. Due to the difference in numbers, the difference in the number of strikes, and the absolute suppression of strength, hundreds of Baiming cavalry were cut down from their horses. They fell to the ground and became minced meat under the horses' hooves. Retreat. Retreat quickly. After this collision, the last bit of hope in Yiligong's heart had disappeared. Seeing his subordinates being chopped into minced meat the moment they entered the enemy's formation, he who had already stopped his horse, turned around and fled without any hesitation or politeness. The main general suddenly turned around and fled with his bodyguards. Following that, more and more northern Ming cavalry also cursed and wanted to turn around and flee. However, it was not that easy to escape. Behind them, Chunyang had already led his cavalry and charged forward. Under their repeated attacks, Baiming cavalry were cut down one after another. When some of the northern Ming cavalrymen wanted to counterattack, they suddenly realized that their companions were no longer around. When he had to face the continuous attacks of more than a dozen cold vanguard cavalrymen, he could block one or two strikes, but could he block the third strike, the fourth strike, or even more? In the first place, the speed of the saber attacks was not as fast as a human's. After blocking a few attacks, the surrounded northern Ming cavalry were like sheep that had entered a wolf's den. They were instantly devoured and not even their bones were left behind. Such a scene continued to happen on the battlefield. Wherever there was a surviving northern Ming cavalryman, there would be a dozen or even dozens of cold vanguard cavalrymen slaughtering him. As a result, the northern Ming cavalrymen were like small boats sailing in the sea, facing huge waves one after another. No one could survive, no one. Originally, it should have been an evenly matched cavalry charge, but it had turned into a completely one-sided situation. From the beginning to the end, only half an hour had passed. Other than Yiligong, who escaped with less than 50 bodyguards, the other 2,950 Baiming cavalry were all killed. Not a single captive was left. Not even a single wounded person was left. Of course, this was because Leng Feng wanted to establish his dominance, but at the same time, it was also because the 6 battalions were too eager to prove their worth. That was why they didn't hold back and killed with all their might, resulting in this outcome. Tabulate the battle results. Spring Sun was covered in blood. He had killed more than 4 Baiming cavalry. Although it wasn't as many as he had expected, he had no choice. He had killed too many people with his muskets. It was already good enough that he was able to get 4. Without any enemies, he began to tabulate the battle results. He wanted to see how many casualties he had suffered. 13 of my battalion died. 7 are wounded. 16 of my battalion are wounded. No wounded. 12 of my brothers died. 2 are wounded. 13 of my brothers died. No wounded. 7 of my battalion died. 4 wounded. All of them are lightly wounded. My battalion. The battle results were quickly tabulated. Spring Sun nodded to show that he understood. He turned around and galloped towards Division Commander Wu Sheng and Political Commissar Chen Bo, reporting to Division Commander, Political Commissar. In this battle 70 of our brothers died. 18 are wounded. We killed 2,950 enemies. No prisoners. When Spring Sun arrived in front of the two division commanders and reported the results of the battle, the three divisions couldn't help but burst into thunderous cheers. This result made Wuxia and Qin Bo very satisfied. There were always casualties in war. It didn't matter if you had the right time, the right place, or the right people. After all, accidents were everywhere. To be able to kill nearly 3,000 enemies with less than 100 casualties was already a miracle. Good, very good. We will remember this great achievement. Let's celebrate tonight. Division Commander Wuxia laughed loudly. At this moment he knew that the quasi-cold vanguard of the 6 battalions had become a qualified cold vanguard brother after this bloody battle. The combat strength of the 3 divisions had also improved greatly after this battle. Oh, we won. The other cold vanguard warriors couldn't help but cheer and shout loudly when they heard the celebration. When these voices reached the city, Abdullah's face turned pale with fright. He still didn't know the final result of the battle. However, Baiming's cavalry had been defeated, and they had been defeated very quickly and thoroughly. He saw it clearly. When night came, out of fear they took out more food and sent it to the 3 divisions. The exact results of the battle had also been announced. Less than 100 casualties, 2,950 enemies killed, and nearly 3,000 warhorses were taken. The result made Abdullah almost lose his balance and fall to the ground. With the help of his personal guards, Abdullah sat back down on his chair and remained silent for a long time. He had already determined a fact in his heart. The mercenaries were powerful and could not be provoked. Whoever dared to provoke them would end up dead. Of course, he didn't forget to report everything he saw and heard to his superiors. He could already imagine what their decision would be after seeing this report. The path of the cold vanguard had to be given up, and it had to be given up completely. The camp of the 3 divisions. The banquet, celebration, and recording of achievements were carried out in an orderly manner. Countless soldiers used their military merits to exchange for cigarettes, ham sausages, canned food, and other things. When they held these items in their hands, many of them shed tears. They were originally Baiming's cavalry and looked very powerful. However, only they knew that they were nothing more than a facade. However, after joining the 3 divisions, they had undergone a transformation. They were still themselves, but in front of their former comrades, they were already superior. Even if they couldn't do anything now and retired, they would still be able to get a sum of money to spend the rest of their lives. Although there was still a long way to go before they could become rich, at least they could live a normal life and get married and have children. However, was this really their goal in life? No. They could still continue to work hard and obtain more glory and wealth. After a few more years of hard work, it wouldn't be a problem for them to build a good family background and property for their descendants. At this moment, the hearts of the soldiers were filled with hope and longing for the future. The birth of these ideals would make them stronger and more fearless. This battle established the belief that the 3 divisions were powerful and invincible. Not long after, Nuergon Duci issued a clear rule. It said that the mercenaries were fighting for the peace of Baiming's north and were worthy of respect. It was also very reasonable that they needed a logistical supply line. No guards were allowed to obstruct or interfere. Otherwise, they would be severely punished. This was the result of fighting. This was the result of showing their strength. Everything was not out of Wuxia and Qin Bo's expectations. They knew that they were very close to completing the mission given by the 6th young master. The next day after receiving the news, the 3 divisions left Jian Province's Suwei city and headed straight for Sea Town. The supplies were already at sea and would arrive soon. Their next mission was to gather at Sea Town and then unload the supplies and transport them back to Shur City. Then they would be done. As for the safety of this road in the future, they were not worried. Unless they didn't want to live, they really couldn't think of anyone who would dare to stop the logistical army under the banner of mercenaries here. Shur City. It had been a month and a half since they occupied this place and started the construction. During this period of time, the city had undergone great changes. The appearance of the city had taken shape with the investment of a huge amount of manpower, material resources, and financial resources. The construction in the city had already begun. When they walked to the street, Shur City had become much more lively. Originally, there were only 1,000 people in the city. Now the number of people in the city had reached more than 2,000, nearly 10,000 people. The fact that the population in the city could increase so much in such a short period of time naturally had a lot to do with Yang Qindong's personal and external policies. Duke of Loyalty, God of War, and even Dong Shui were some of Yang Qindong's nicknames. He had been famous for a long time. It was difficult for others not to know him. With his personal influence, first of all, some Han people who lived alone nearby were willing to come to the city. During this period of time, Zhou Xian's reconnaissance battalion, in addition to monitoring the movements of the nearby Mongolian tribes, had another important task, which was to constantly convey the news of the policies towards the Han people. For example, the Duke of Loyalty was the savior of the Han people. As long as they were Han people and were willing to follow the rules, the Duke of Loyalty would help them, give them work, give them food, and let them live a better life. These slogans and news spread everywhere. Not only the Han people but also the Mongolian people. As long as they were willing to follow the rules of the city and had the strength and were willing to work, they were also welcomed. They could work to earn money and use the silver or copper coins to buy various items that they needed. Sure City was an open city. It was a city with full freedom. It was a city that pursued fairness and reasonableness. As long as you were willing to come and follow the rules here, you would become a welcome person. Here, as long as you put in effort, you would be rewarded. It was very fair. There was no oppression or oppression. Your things were yours. You didn't have to worry that everything would be gone when you woke up. Chapter 702. It was precisely this concept that attracted groups of people to settle in after it was spread out. First it was a few people, then a dozen people, then dozens of people. Soon, it expanded to hundreds of people, thousands of people, and then nearly 10,000 people. Even this number was increasing every day. Speaking of which, everything was due to the rules of the grassland. It was particular about the law of the jungle. It was particular about the law of the jungle. Whoever was more powerful would have all the good things. As for the weak, some people might sympathize with them, but it was only sympathy. On the day you were bullied, no hero would appear to help you. They were used to snatching and being robbed when they saw good things. As a result, many kind-hearted people did not like to stay on the grassland, especially those who lived alone. They often did not have a neighbor within dozens or even hundreds of miles. Once they encountered a grassland bandit, they could only wait for death. This feeling was very bad. If it was in the past, they did not have a place to go and did not have a better way to solve the problem. It seemed that they could only choose to join a grassland tribe. Even so, they had to pay too much and could become a sacrifice in the war at any time. If they were unlucky and the leader of the tribe took a fancy to something, they would also have to contribute. That feeling was like falling into a bandit's lair. The first city was different. As long as one was willing to come here, there would be a ready-made house for one to live in. Of course, one would have to pay the rent every month. However, this was not a problem. There were many jobs to do in the city now. Building a city and building houses was a rich income. As long as one worked hard to earn money, one would not have to worry about it. As long as one had their own house, anything that they earned would belong to them. No one would come to rob them, no matter who the other party was or what kind of identity they had. Otherwise, the law enforcement team that appeared on the streets at any time in the city would teach the other party how to behave. It was this kind of protection policy that attracted a large number of people to the first city. When they familiarized themselves with the rules here and found that it was indeed different from the outside world, many people quickly fell in love with this place. While they chose to live here, they also spread the news, allowing more relatives and friends to come and stay here. After all, everyone would want to have more old friends by their side when they arrived at a new place. This would give them a sense of security. There were more and more people in the city, and the labor problem was solved accordingly. In the largest mansion in the beginning city, Yang Qindong was sitting there and resting. Some of the tension on his face disappeared, and there was a trace of relaxation. This was a newly built backyard. There was a large pond and even a rockery. To be able to have such things in the prairie city could only be described as extravagant. However, no one thought that this was wrong. The sixth young master had done so much for everyone. Was it wrong for him to want a better environment and conditions to rest? No one should even think of shaking Yang Qindong's position in the army or speaking ill of him. Otherwise, he would be beaten up so badly that even his mother wouldn't be able to recognize him. Sitting in the garden to rest, Yang Qindong did not forget to look at the information in his hand. Seemed like a while had passed, but it also seemed like a long time had passed. He lifted his head and looked at Tiger's Mane, who was at the side, and asked, "This is the data from this morning. It says that the number of people in the city has exceeded 10,000? Yes, the statistics were out last night. The number of people is about 10,300. Compared to the 9,800 people from the day before, there are 500 more people now. This number should increase today. Young master, you're amazing." Tiger's Mane could not help but give him a thumbs up when he mentioned this. When the city was first built, the city was so vast, and it was not that no one had discussed it before. They thought that this was a grassland after all, and it was different from the Central Plains. It was normal to not see a single family for dozens of miles. In such a place, building a city was originally a very extravagant thing, let alone building such a big city. Looking at the sixth young master's meaning, the beginning city could accommodate 500,000 people. This was indeed a very frightening number. Even the Mongolian tribes who had lived here for generations did not dare to think about it. They could not see that the sixth young master could do it. Some people even thought that this was the first time that the sixth young master had made a wrong judgment. The development of the facts was indeed not satisfactory at the beginning. Although the reconnaissance camp had released a lot of information, it was still very limited that it could attract people. In the first few days they did not see anyone coming here, let alone living here. However, the situation slowly changed. From a few people who came in a day at the beginning, to more than 10 people, and then to a few hundred people now. The number of people in the city began to increase. More importantly, almost none of the people who came here had walked here before, and that was the most important thing. It was not easy to attract people here, but the most important thing was how to attract people to not leave after they came here. Now it seemed that the sixth young master had done a very good job. The people below could not help but sigh again. The sixth young master was the sixth young master. His vision of things was not comparable to that of ordinary people. Tiger's Mane naturally had never questioned Yang Chendong. On the contrary, he had a kind of blind worship. In his opinion, as long as it was the sixth young master's words, it must be the truth. As long as it was the sixth young master's words, it must be incomparably correct. However, he could not stop the people below him from talking. Now that he had used facts to slap some people in the face, he naturally felt honored and happy. Haha. Looking at Tiger's Mane's sincere and happy smile, Yang Chendong, who was infected, also laughed. Then, as if he had thought of something, he asked, "By the way, why are you always in front of me recently? Don't you still have to lead the independent regiment? I have young heir here. If you have something to do, you can do it yourself." Young master, the independent regiment's combat power has improved a lot. Now when we have nothing to do, we will compete with the Jurchen cavalry regiment. Although we can't win, if we can use firearms, I guarantee that we can destroy the other party in minutes. Besides, with Deputy Regiment Commander Xian Hong Hai watching over there, I am very relieved. Tiger's Mane was reserved and smiled proudly. Is the independent regiment that powerful? This was the first time Yang Chendong heard of it. The main reason was that he had been focusing his energy on building the city recently. Although he had a lot of people under him this time and many of them were smart and capable, there was really no better person to manage the affairs of the city. Those people were all martial artists. When it came to war, their eyes were wide open, but when it came to managing the city, they instantly wilted. He did not know whether to laugh or cry. He had no choice but to do it himself. After all, a person's energy was limited. If he was busy with government affairs, he would not be able to care about the army. Now that he heard Tiger's Mane say that the independent regiment's combat power had greatly improved, he was interested. He asked about the Jurchen cavalry regiment and the strengthening of the 1st and 2nd cavalry regiment. According to Hu Mang, the combat strength of these 4 regiments was increasing every day. In order to achieve more military merits, they would seize the opportunity to train whenever they had the chance. Moreover, it was the kind of training that everyone was willing to do. When they had nothing to do, the 4 regiments would also practice against each other, and the improvement of their combat power was much faster. Good. It is a good thing that you all can take the initiative to think of ways to improve your combat power. This is positive and should be encouraged. Yang Chendong was very happy after hearing this. However, after saying this, he quickly changed his tone and said, "Be prepared for danger in times of peace. Soldiers of my generation must have this kind of awareness. When facing any possible war, we must be able to maintain the best state of mind at all times. Once a war breaks out with a command to gather, we will be able to fight against the enemy. We must win, and we must do so at the smallest cost. Young master, will there really be people coming to find trouble with us? It has already been 1.5 months, and I don't see anyone having any ideas about us. When it came to war, Tiger's mane was interested and his voice became louder. There will be. Yang Qindong said with certainty. If the establishment of the first city did not attract the attention of some of the surrounding forces, it attracted many people to move in with its powerful attraction. This was indeed something that some people did not want to see. On the grassland, it could be said that everything was lacking, so much so that the population was also a hot commodity. When two tribes fought, the winning side would often plunder all the population of the losing side in order to strengthen their own strength. The appearance of the first city had taken in all the individual households. With this, it could be said that it had touched everyone's interests, and this was the fuse of the war. Force was the most direct way to solve the conflict of interests. According to Yang Qindong's thoughts, there were probably already many enemies who could not hold back. It was just that the mercenaries and his reputation were too big, and no one wanted to be the one to stand out. However, as the first city grew stronger, it was obvious that these forces would eventually not be able to hold back and the war should be coming. Just as Yang Qindong and Hu Mang were chatting, a large cavalry team was setting up camp and resting at a place 500 kilometers away from the first city, near a mountain and a river. If the people from the reconnaissance camp could get close to observe, they would naturally find an old acquaintance here. He was Hararuochu, who had suffered a loss in Yang Qindong's hands. That's right, this was the camp of Hararuochu's father Agar Dorji. Originally, he followed his elder brother to expand the Tatar forces, but he could not resist the temptation and finally conspired with the leader of the Walla Yeshen to assassinate his elder brother. Who would have thought that the plan would not be as fast as the changes? In the end, he did not kill his elder brother and had no choice but to escape. Now he had become a rootless tree floating on the grassland. Agar Dorji was still a man of his own ideas. When he rebelled, he brought a total of 50,000 cavalry, which made him a powerful force on the grassland. No one dared to look down on him and no one dared to casually find trouble with him. This made him comfortable for a while. Chapter 703. However, the daily food and drinks of the 50,000 cavalrymen was not a small expense. Although he had received some benefits from Yeshen, it would eventually run out. If one did not consider the future, there would be immediate worries. Now Agar Dorji urgently needed a foothold and income. Otherwise, the 50,000 cavalrymen would leave him sooner or later. In order to find a suitable place, he had thought of forming an alliance with the Gobi Mongol Empire. He wanted to let his son marry Princess Tuoya and strengthen the relationship between the two sides through marriage. Unfortunately, his son Hararuo was too ugly. He was so ugly that Tuoya did not like him at all. In addition, Sudur Khan was not very courageous and was afraid that he would swallow up the other side, so the marriage did not happen. Not only that, but because of the battle with the 5-star army, he lost 5,000 cavalrymen and a general like Lumak. For this matter, Agar Dorji scolded his son and even gave him 2 horsewhips as punishment. Then he naturally thought of finding trouble with the 5-star army. Since they beat him, they should be prepared to be beaten back. But he never thought that the 5-star army would suddenly become a mercenary army. This made Agar Dorji think of giving up. The reputation of a mercenary army and a war god was too big. In the grasslands, Yeshen's strength was obviously the strongest. Especially since he had done business with Baiming a while ago, who knew how many rare goods were shipped to the grasslands through his hands. These goods had become sought-after goods in the eyes of the grasslands nobles. He had made a lot of money. With money, there was naturally a greater opportunity to increase his strength. It could only be said that Yeshen was stronger than before. He even had a faint sense of superiority. His strength made Yeshen somewhat dizzy. He actually wanted to find trouble with Baiming again, wanting to use the war to plunder and strengthen himself. After all, he had worked with Yeshen before and their relationship was not bad. Agar Dorji had asked for Yeshen's opinion on the matter of the origin city. However, the seemingly fearless Yeshen actually gave him a piece of advice, which was that it was best not to provoke the war god because it was not something that humans could defeat. Yeshen's words were decisive. When Agar Dorji first heard it, he did hesitate. But now he seemed to have no choice. The army's provisions would be exhausted in a month at most. If he could not find more food or a foothold during this time, There might be a mutiny in the army. If that happened, where would he go? Big brother Tuochuo Buhua had probably sent people to keep an eye on him. At that time, would he take the opportunity to deal with him? Then there was Xianxia. Although their relationship seemed to be good now, in fact the other party couldn't wait to devour him. If it were not for the fact that he still had 45,000 cavalrymen in his hands, the other party would have taken action long ago. This could be seen from the fact that he wanted to borrow food from the other party but was rejected with all kinds of excuses. There was a wolf in front and a tiger behind. This was the true portrayal of Agar Dorji's current situation. Reality also forced him to set his sights on the origin city. The scouts he sent out had already gathered enough information. There were mercenaries and a lot of silver in the origin city. It was said that the Han people and Mongols who worked there could earn a lot of silver every day. How much money does this Duke of Loyalty have? Agar Dorji often could not help but think, and the greed in his heart grew stronger and stronger. Someone once said that when the benefits reached 10 times, it was enough to make many people forget about life and death and take risks. If the benefits could reach 100 times, many people would be willing to do it even if they knew that they might die. Now Agar Dorji was blinded by the benefits. Or rather, he had no better way to solve the problem he was facing. It seemed that only by taking down the origin city and taking the silver there could the army be stabilized again. Once he occupied the origin city, he would have a foothold and could walk out of the current difficulties. There were so many benefits that even with Yeshin's reminder, Agar Dorji still decided to take the risk. After making a decision, he summoned his son and 2 of his generals to discuss the matter of attacking the origin city. Agar Dorji still had some tricks up his sleeves. When his brother was not under his command, he had won over some capable generals. For example, Lumik, who had died in the previous battle, and Su He and Gulang, who were now summoned. Su He was a general who was praised by the great Khan of Tuochuo Buhua. His name was translated into Chinese and meant axe. In fact, after this person went to the battlefield, he was indeed like a sharp axe. He had cut down countless enemies. This time, when the 3 of them were summoned, the first person Agar Dorji asked was Su He. General Su, I'm going to attack the origin city. There are piles of gold and silver there as well as strong city walls. Many people have gathered there. If we can occupy that place, they will all become our slaves. By then we can use them to create more wealth for the army. We will not have to worry about food and clothing. Our cavalry will trample the entire grassland and dominate the area. Agar Dorji outlined a beautiful picture of the future. The more he spoke, the more excited he became. His son, Haruo, was so excited that little stars appeared in front of his eyes. He seemed to see groups of beautiful women and piles of gold and silver in front of him for him to choose from. General Gulang's eyes also revealed a yearning look. He was very tempted. However, Su He, who was asked in the tent, was calm and was not excited by these words. General Su He, what do you think? The most important thing was Su He's ability. Seeing that the other party did not express his opinion, Agar Dorji could not help but ask anxiously. Su He, who was asked, still did not answer immediately. Instead, after thinking carefully in his mind, he slowly said, Sir, as far as I know, the war god is in the origin city. He's an existence that even Xianxia is afraid of. Can we go and find trouble with him? Why not? We've already asked around. The war god only has less than 15,000 cavalrymen under him. We do have 45,000 cavalrymen, which is 3 times the number of the enemy. This battle can be fought, Haruo said. It could be seen that he was a little dissatisfied with Su He's cautiousness. Yes, I think we can fight too. So what if he's the war god? After all, this is the grassland. In the end, it depends on whose warhorse is faster and whose saber is sharper. Gulang also spoke, expressing his thoughts of supporting the battle. Out of the 4 people in the tent, 3 of them had now expressed their opinions. They all supported attacking the origin city. Su He knew that no matter whether he agreed or not, this battle had to go on. He had to nod and said, well, I respect everyone's opinions. But we can fight, but we still need to consider how to fight. Okay, then let's discuss who will be the vanguard and how to fight. Seeing that Su He also agreed, Agar Dorji was overjoyed and set the tone. In the following time, the 4 of them discussed for a long time and finally decided to set the battlefield outside the origin city. After all, they were all cavalrymen and siege warfare was not their forte. If the battlefield could be set in the vast grassland, they would have a higher chance of winning. Whether it was out of greed or helplessness, Agar Dorji finally decided to take action. All 45,000 cavalrymen were mobilized. They set off early the next morning with an unstoppable momentum and headed to the origin city that was 500 miles away. In the origin city, there was still no news from Agar Dorji. After all, the grassland was too big and most of it was plains. There was no place to hide, which greatly hindered the movement of the cavalry of the reconnaissance battalion. There was no cover, so they could not get close to the enemy. Naturally, they could not be prepared in advance. It was precisely because he knew this that Yang Chendong had asked the 3 regiments under him to maintain a fighting spirit at all times. They had to be able to come whenever they were summoned, fight whenever they were summoned, and win whenever they fought. The city was still being built in an orderly manner. Another day passed, and the number of people from various races who came to the origin city increased again. It increased by 500 people day by day. Today alone, more than 1,000 people came, and most of them were Mongolian brothers who brought their families. According to the rules of entering the city, they had to register their identity first, and then pay a certain amount of money. After that, they would be arranged to use a house for a month. Finally, different jobs would be arranged according to each person's different conditions. You must carefully screen the body of the person who comes. You must not let a factor of stability appear in the city. Yang Chendong walked on the streets of the origin city. Beside him were Tiger's Mane, Beta Persei, and a group of people who were protecting him. Walking in the crowd, the 6th young master spoke from time to time about some things to pay attention to. Yes, we have special people doing the relevant work. Not only do people need to report their real names, but they also need to report the place where they used to live. We have people who will investigate this afterwards. Although I dare not say that there is no problem 100% for those who have doubts, we have focused on monitoring. Tiger's Mane kept nodding as he reported his work. That's the way it should be. Don't let a piece of rat poop spoil the pot of soup. We can also fully mobilize the people and let them take the initiative to expose those who have bad intentions or have strange behavior. We can give them a certain amount of rewards appropriately. In this way, unless they can pretend to be the same person, they can't escape everyone's eyes. Also, if we can confirm that they are spies sent by other forces, we can also allow them to come in and sneak in. However, they can't live here. We have to let others know of our strength so that they will be afraid. Yang Chendong also nodded with a smile and gave his own experience and opinions. Chapter 704. Young Master, this is a good order. I'll send someone to pass it on right away. Tiger's Mane's eyes lit up and he remembered this suggestion in his heart. Yang Chendong, who was flattered again, chuckled. But before he could continue to say anything, the commander of the reconnaissance battalion, Zhou Xian, rode a horse and rushed over from the other side of the street. Although the first city was still under construction, there were rules that cavalries were not allowed to pass through the streets for no reason. However, some people were always exceptions, such as the cavalries who had received military orders and the brothers of the reconnaissance battalion. The soldiers of the reconnaissance battalion were in contact with the front line of the battlefield intelligence. In order to spread the news at the first possible moment, they naturally had some privileges. Zhou Xian came riding a horse. This originally indicated that something big must have happened. Everyone stood firm and stopped. The guards even faintly formed a semicircle, closely protecting Yang Chendong. This had already become a habit. If any accident happened, they would have to pay at least several times the price to get close to the 6th young master. Who? As soon as the sound came out of Zhou Xian's mouth, he landed in front of Yang Chendong. After a standard military salute, he said, 6th young master, there's an urgent military situation at the front. Inform all the senior officers of the regiments and battalions to have a meeting in the war room. Yang Chendong also became a lot more serious and said with a slightly serious voice. In the newly built spacious conference room in the first city, in just half an hour, the main cadres of the 4 regiments in the city were gathered here. Looking from afar, a group of military officers could be seen flashing in and out of their seats. The commander of the Guli Regiment Tiger's Mane and the deputy commander Xian Honghai, the commander of the Nuzan Cavalry Regiment Yila and the deputy commander Lu Dai, the commander of the 1st Cavalry Regiment Shui Feng, the commander of the 1st Battalion Deng Yu, the commander of the 2nd Battalion Gao Danhua, and the commander of the 3rd Battalion Hu Lu, the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment Lu Zhuo, the commander of the 1st Battalion Ma Xiangshan, the commander of the 2nd Battalion Ding Shan, the commander of the 3rd Battalion Taimura, and the others were all present. Yang Qindong presided over the meeting, and the reconnaissance battalion commander Su Yunxing introduced the enemy situation. Su Yunxing held a slender wooden stick in his hand, drew a line on a huge map hanging high in the meeting room, and said with a loud voice, "Ladies and gentlemen, the scouts in the front have reported that Agadorji is leading 45,000 cavalrymen to the beginning city. According to our investigation, there are about 20,000 elite cavalrymen and 25,000 ordinary cavalrymen. It is estimated that they will arrive at the West River in the west of the beginning city in 3 days, tomorrow and the day after tomorrow." After introducing the information, Su Yunxing gave a standard military salute to Yang Qindong and returned to his original seat, waiting for the military order to be issued. After the introduction of the battle report, the discussions of the higher-ranking officers below quickly rang out. It could be seen that everyone's face was filled with excitement. After staying for 50 days, there was finally a battle to be fought. Every one of them was a warmonger. It could be said that their faces were glowing. It seemed that they couldn't wait to appear on the battlefield in the next moment and fight 500 rounds with the enemy. Yang Qindong did not intend to stop everyone from discussing together. On the contrary, he looked at them with interest. He wanted to understand everyone's mentality as soon as possible through observation. To his satisfaction, none of the officers showed any signs of fear or trepidation. The morale of the army could be used. This word popped into Yang Qindong's mind. He knew that even though this battle was going to be tough, it was still a good time for the mercenaries to establish their might. Well, since no one has any objections, then this young master will make the decision. Fight. Does anyone have any questions? No. Sure enough, the voices below were extremely unified. One by one they opened their mouths and shouted. No one objected. Yang Qindong also stood up and led everyone to the three-dimensional sand table at the side. After that, Yang Qindong, who was waving the stick in his hand, kept waving it. The north side of the beginning city is the north slope. It is easy to defend and difficult to attack. We can make a fuss about it. The west side of the West River has just had a heavy rain 2 days ago. The river is rising rapidly, which can be used to stop the enemy's frontal attack. We can also make a fuss about it. The south side of the South Forest is suitable for hiding the army. This time the number of the enemy's cavalry is 3 times more than ours. It is absolutely impossible to fight head-on. Even if we can defeat the enemy, it will be a Pyrrhic victory in the end. This is our first real battle in the grasslands. We must win, not lose. That's why I ask all the officers and soldiers not to underestimate the enemy. We need everyone to be cautious, kill the enemy bravely on the battlefield and make a name for ourselves. After training for such a long time, it is finally time for us to perform. Now I order. Swoosh. All the officers above the battalion level straightened their bodies and fixed their eyes on Yang Qindong. Each of them puffed out their chests and expressed their most confident side perfectly. It was as if they were afraid that they would not be able to get the main task if they were not careful. I order. Yang Qindong's mouth kept making sounds. He arranged the military orders one by one. The officers who received the orders nodded their heads. A large net was spread out with the beginning city as the center. Nearly 50,000 cavalrymen under Agadorji came and rode on the vast grassland. Wherever they went, the scattered grassland herdsmen fled. Some of them even had to abandon their sheep pens in order to escape. Along the way, the army had robbed thousands of sheep and horses. Slaughter, slaughter them all. Pass down the order to make a good meal for the warriors to satisfy their hunger. After we take down the beginning city, I will celebrate with everyone. Agadorji ordered in a tone that was used to win over the people's hearts. Then he turned to look at Su He and his son, Hilaro, and asked, "The vanguard led by General Glenn should be arriving at the beginning city soon, right?" Yes, according to the schedule he should have arrived at the West River. He should be looking for a tool to cross the river. Su He replied, and his face continued to darken. He was also the only one who was not optimistic about this battle. During the period of the alliance with Walla and Yeshen, He learned more than once from the other general about their experience with the mercenaries 3 years ago. The more he learned, the more he knew how powerful the mercenaries were. At that time, Wallace's troops could be said to have won a great victory. They were all cavalrymen and had an absolute advantage in speed. However, in the face of the mercenaries who were many times smaller than them, they still returned in defeat. Therefore, he did not think that they could take advantage of the advantage of numbers this time. It was just that they really had no way out now. At present, the closest and most suitable enemy was the mercenaries of the first city. If they wanted to get out of the current predicament, they could only fight with them. As for whether they would win or not, they would do their best and leave it to fate. West River? Very good. I hope General Glenn can find a way to cross the river soon. In this way, our army can go straight in and kill our way to the beginning city. By the way, I also heard that there is still a section of the outer wall in the beginning city that has not been completely built. Our cavalry can kill our way into the city from there. At that time, everything in the city will be ours. Agadorji laughed wildly on his horse as if he had already won at this moment. It was as if the mercenaries were at his mercy. The reason why Agadorji was so confident was that the number of his cavalrymen was 3 times that of the other party. He thought in his heart that even if the other party had continuous fire guns, as long as they set up a formation, with the advantage of the cavalry's speed and number, how many people could the other party kill in a short time? Once the other party charged together, it would be the time for them to kill the other party. At that time, the advantage of the cavalry would be maximized and the victory would still belong to them. There was another point that Agadorji did not mention, and that was that he actually looked down on the Han people. Even if this Han was the loyal duke of the great Ming dynasty and was known as the god of war, it was still the same. Everyone knew that the people of the grassland ate meat. They killed cows and wolves and were ferocious. Since ancient times, the Han people took farming as their duty. They were loyal and honest and were vegetarians. It was difficult for them to be opponents of the grassland people. Unless there was an emperor of great talent and a general who had won every battle, only then could the Han people defeat the people of the grassland. Back then, Zhu Yuanzhang had spent a lot of effort to chase the Mongols back to the Mongolian grassland. Zhu Di's 5 expeditions to the Mongols had only weakened the Mongols. 20 years later, Yes Hen defeated the Ming army at the Timu Castle. If it was not for Yang Qindong's timely intervention, Zhu Qizhen would have been captured alive. Throughout the Ming dynasty had lost more wars than wars with the Mongols. As time passed, the strength of the Ming dynasty also decreased. With these facts in front of him, it was fine for Agadorji to be more confident. Not to mention this time he had brought 3 times the number of his enemies. However, he did not know that if he exaggerated his advantage and looked down on the other party, it would only cause him to lose even more miserably. It would only cause him to enter a state of no return. This was because he did not take into account the firearms in the hands of the mercenaries. In the cold weapons era, the Mongol cavalry were invincible and conquered the world. Even the Russians were slaves to the Mongols. The Golden Horde had ruled Russia for nearly 300 years. Every time the Russian nobles knelt before the Mongols would burn, kill and plunder in Russia and commit all kinds of crimes. The Russians were angry, but they did not dare to speak out. The stars changed and the era changed. The Western world entered the era of hot weapons. Guns and cannons were really strong and a single cannon could kill a large number of cavalry. At the end of the Ming dynasty, Yuan Chonghuan used cannons to kill Nurhasai. The 8 Banners' disciples were like scarecrows in front of Yuan Chonghuan. During the Crow War, the British army only had a few thousand men and defeated the Qing army of over 1 million. At that time, tens of thousands of Mongol elites led by Green Qin attacked the British army of a few hundred. What happened? The Mongol cavalry was wiped out and the British army only lost a few people. In the face of modernity, the Mongols were just a joke. When the Russians were in Vasilyevsk, they learned from the West and used guns to conquer Siberia. How could those with knives be a match for those with guns? A few hundred Russians wiped out all the Mongols in Siberia. From then on, Russia became a huge empire that spanned across Asia and Europe. The Qing dynasty ruined the country for 300 years, and when China needed strength the most, it weakened. Chapter 705. This was the power of the flintlock in actual combat. Of course, the flintlock was not omnipotent. As long as the soldiers were united and did not fear death, it was not impossible to turn the situation around. But the problem was, what kind of fighting spirit would be needed to achieve this? At least Agadorji could not do it. Fortunately, Yang Qindong, who was regarded as his enemy, did not intend to defend the city. He also wanted to use this opportunity to train his cavalry and decided to fight outside the city. And if he was willing to defend and not come out of the city, then not to mention the 50,000 cavalry, even if another 50,000 cavalry came, they would not be able to gain the slightest advantage. The advantage of the flintlock was more in defense, especially when facing fast cavalry. Attacking was equivalent to giving up most of one's advantages. But Yang Qindong still wanted to do this, which in itself proved that he was confident in the strength of his cavalry. Perhaps in his opinion, even if the cavalry charged, even if they used the most primitive method, his mercenaries were the strongest in the world. Of course, Yang Qindong only wanted to use this opportunity to train his cavalry. He did not really want to play to his strengths and avoid his weaknesses. He knew very well when to use the most primitive method to fight. For example, in the West River War Zone, he used the flintlock to fight against Gulang and his 5,000 enemy cavalry. Gulang obtained the qualification of the Vanguard General. This did not mean that he was brave and good at fighting, but because Suhi did not fight for it and did not care about it. In the end, he was just a touchstone, a stepping stone to test the strength of the mercenaries. In front of the mercenaries, Gulang became a whetstone, but he did not know it. After hearing the news and making arrangements, Glenn led 5,000 cavalrymen to the West River and saw the mercenary army stationed on the other side of the river. This was the independent regiment led by Tiger's Mane. A regiment had 16 battalions, which made them far more powerful than an ordinary regiment or even a division. Both sides looked at each other across the river. Facing such a powerful opponent, Gulang sneered and began to arrange the cavalry to find trees and make rafts to prepare to cross the river. As a Mongolian from the grasslands, Gulang did not think much of the 6,000 enemies in front of him. He noticed that the other party's camp was still 3 miles away from the river. And if he could cross the river on a raft at the first moment, he could even kill his way to the front of the enemy through the West River. It was very possible for him to obtain a good start by catching them off guard. General, our cavalrymen have tested it out. There are 2 sections where the riverbed is relatively high, and the water flow isn't that strong. We should be able to cross the river directly, a Chiliarch reported in an agitated voice as he arrived beside Gulang. What? Glenn, who was riding a horse by the river and looking at the enemy's camp, suddenly heard this and his eyes widened. General, I've already found a suitable place to cross the river. As long as we execute it well, we might be able to catch them off guard, the Chiliarch continued in an excited manner. Gulang also became more agitated. His body even trembled slightly. Is what you said true? The riverbed is really not high and warhorses can gallop freely? Yes, some of our brothers have lived here since young. I heard them say that when they were young they tried to cross the river on horseback. They know where the riverbed is higher and suitable for cavalrymen. Just now they intentionally tried it and found that there were no changes. It seems that this secret is only known by the locals. The mercenaries have just arrived and are oppressing the people of the grasslands. It is reasonable that they do not know about this. This time not only did the Chiliarch reveal the source of the information, he also helped to analyze the weaknesses of the mercenaries. When Gulang heard all of this, he could not help but nod his head. Good, the heavens are really watching over us. Haha, since that is the case, make the arrangements. We will cross the river at night and catch them off guard. Yes, General, the Chiliarch said excitedly. If he could win this battle, it would undoubtedly be equivalent to him making a great contribution. At this moment, neither of them had the intention to send someone to inform Sir Agar Dorji, who was waiting for news at the rear. Perhaps in their eyes, any bold words were far less effective than the truth. Or perhaps, they were worried that if they reported this matter, His Excellency would send someone else to carry out this mission, just like how he might send his disappointing son Hilaro to lead the army. If that was the case, wouldn't all their previous efforts be wasted? Without informing anyone, Gulang gathered some of the Chiliarchs in the army to discuss the plan for the night. Although the riverbed was higher and they could cross the river without the use of wooden rafts, they would still have to cross the river. But after all, they were walking in muddy water. It was said that the high water level could even submerge the legs of the horses. Under such conditions, it was best to carry as little as possible so that the horses could move faster and achieve an unexpected effect. Pass down the order. Except for the necessary sabers, throw everything else on this side of the river. When we attack the beginning city, we will have all kinds of good things. Why would we care about throwing away these things? Gulang made a decision in a very generous manner. Facing this decision, no one refuted it. Perhaps the moment everyone knew that they could cross the river on horseback, they had already determined that this victory would belong to them. However, if they had heard the historical story of the drowning of the 7 armies, they would not be so optimistic. In the independent regiment's barracks 3 miles away from the shore of the West River, Regiment Commander Tiger Mane was imitating the young master and staring at a simple sand table in front of him. In front of him stood a battalion commander who was reporting the enemy's movements. Commander, as expected, the other party didn't go looking for a wooden raft. Instead, they set up camp and started cooking. It seems that they have fallen into our trap. When the battalion commander said this, he was a little agitated and his eyes were a little bright. Of course they will fall into a trap. This is the plan that the young master came up with. Tiger Mane said confidently. Then he seemed to be worried and asked, "Have the upper echelons of the West River made any arrangements? As soon as the signal flare rises into the sky, they must open the floodgates and release the water." Regiment Commander, please rest assured. Deputy Regiment Commander Xin Hong Hai is carrying out the mission over there. There will be no problem. That's good. Tell the soldiers to get some rest and prepare to catch the fish at night. Once again, Hu Mang's eyes revealed a strong sense of confidence. In his eyes, the 5,000 cavalrymen were already fish in the net and food on the plate. Both sides had their own arrangements and were waiting for the sky to turn dark. At the end of July, the days were long and the nights were short. The sky also turned dark late. It was not until 9 o'clock at night that the sky turned completely dark. Finally, Gulang's side began to move. Under the cover of the night, Gulang's cavalrymen began to divide into 2 groups and entered the West River. Following the route that they had chosen beforehand, the cavalrymen entered the water one by one like dumplings. The sound of splashing could be heard endlessly. Be careful. Don't alert the enemy. Also, don't light any torches. Don't let others discover our movements. Some of the centurions reprimanded the cavalrymen in a low voice. Then they entered the river with a cautious look. Their movements were indeed very careful. Little did they know that there was a type of telescope called the night vision device that had already seen their every move. These pitiful cavalrymen still thought that what they were doing was undetectable. As a matter of fact, every step was seen clearly by the other party. "Regiment Commander, the enemy has begun to move," a soldier whispered to Tiger Mane beside a mound of dirt. As the regiment commander of an independent regiment, how could Tiger Mane be at ease if he did not see such a big event with his own eyes? Therefore he personally came this time and saw the enemy cavalrymen enter the river with his own eyes. At this moment, all the worries in his heart turned into shadows. Oh, no rush. Let's wait until their main force enters the middle of the river before opening the floodgates. It will be very exciting when that time comes. Tiger Mane's voice was filled with relaxation and satisfaction. The West River was about 300 feet wide. Due to the climate and the environment, the water supply was only sufficient during the summer rainy season. However, the distance of nearly 100 meters in the water was enough for them to walk for a while. In order to achieve the goal of catching the enemy off guard, Gulang did not make any moves. Glenn didn't have any intention of probing and decided to send his entire army in. After calculating the exact location of the 2 higher riverbeds, he sent all of his cavalrymen forward. It could be seen that this time he was determined to break through to the other side of the river and deal a heavy blow to the mercenaries there. More and more cavalrymen entered the river. If one looked carefully, it seemed that everything was going smoothly. Although the deepest part of the river was already below the hooves of the war horses, the people were still fine. Since they were already prepared, the cavalrymen all held their riding boots in their hands. Even if their feet were a little wet, it did not affect them much. The first cavalrymen were already less than 20 meters away from the shore. The river began to lower again and the army behind continued to press forward. Finally, when the first cavalryman had already leaped onto the shore, the rest of the cavalrymen entered the river. Even General Gulang himself entered the river under the protection of a few soldiers. Fire the signal flare. Seeing that all the enemies had entered the trap, Tiger Mane, who was hiding on the other side of the river, finally gave the order to attack. A soldier of the independent regiment beside him immediately took out the signal flare that he had prepared beforehand and fired it into the dark sky. Bang! A loud gunshot broke the silence of the night. It also broke the shackles of darkness in the dark night. What replaced it was a bright light that flashed in mid-air, as sudden and bright as the appearance of a meteor. Chapter 706. What's going on? Out of instinct, all the cavalrymen in the river and on the shore couldn't help but look up. They couldn't understand why such a bright white light would suddenly appear in the darkness. What was going on? Could it be that the gods had manifested? The white light slowly flew up to the sky, but when it reached a certain height, it finally started to fall slowly. It was really like a meteor falling in midair. Then the land returned to darkness. Although the white light wasn't there for some reason, everyone had a bad feeling in their hearts. Naturally, they didn't know that this was a signal flare. This meant that the mercenaries were about to launch an all-out attack. However, their intuition told them that this sudden appearance wasn't a good sign. Once the bad feeling appeared, it was quickly confirmed. First, there was a slightly anxious but indescribable sound that resounded in their ears. The sound was very soft at the beginning, but it became very clear later on. It became louder and louder until it couldn't be stopped. Not good. There were some people in the crowd who knew how to swim and had lived by the river since they were young. Their expressions changed drastically as they suddenly shouted, "It's the sound of the river rushing. We've fallen into a trap. The upstream river must have been blocked before, and now the sluice gate is suddenly opened. Quick, let's rush to the other side of the river. Quick. Quick, rush over and we'll live. Otherwise we'll definitely die if we stay in the water. Quickly rush to the other side of the river. Quick." Obviously, more than one person understood this principle. The sound of the flowing water became louder and louder, and finally all kinds of shouts were heard. However, because there were too many people shouting, they couldn't hear clearly. Those who understood naturally urged their horses forward with all their might. Those who couldn't hear clearly were still stunned. They looked around blankly as if they were still waiting for an explanation. Wah, wah, wah. The sound of the flowing water was finally getting closer. The most direct reaction was that the water that could only submerge the hooves of the war horses suddenly reached the waist of the war horses. Then it submerged the entire war horses. Even the cavalrymen on the war horses tilted and fell into the river with a splash. Such a scene happened more and more. Many soldiers who couldn't react in time fell into the river in fear. In such a turbulent river in the middle of the night, even some of the soldiers who were good at swimming would not be spared. Not to mention that many of the cavalrymen's feet were still attached to the stirrups of their horses, greatly hindering their movements. The moment the war horses were washed away by the river, it was already an indication of how many cavalrymen had fallen into the death trap. Under the pressure of death, more and more cavalrymen unleashed their potential and rushed to the other side of the river. It was less than 100 meters away, but at this moment, it was as if a chasm had appeared in front of them, making them feel as if they were so close yet so far away. Even the cavalrymen who were lucky enough to reach the shore weren't safe. On the contrary, after they had exhausted all their strength to reach the other side, what awaited them was a series of arrows that rained down on them. Under such an indiscriminate barrage of arrows, it was difficult for anyone to truly survive. A few lucky people rode on their war horses and broke through the rain. Just as they were about to reach the soldiers of the independent regiment who had been waiting for them, hundreds of loaded muskets were waiting for them. They were waiting for the scene of their bodies turning into a hornet's nest. Glenn's luck wasn't bad. He had just entered the river when he realized that the situation wasn't right. Under the protection of a few bodyguards, he retreated. He was one of the lucky ones among the 5,000. When the river suddenly rose under artificial control, his face turned pale and he kept repeating, "It's over, it's over, it's all over." Out of the 5,000 cavalrymen, only he and his 8 bodyguards managed to escape. The other brothers either died in the water or under the strong bows and muskets of the mercenaries. From the beginning to the end, they didn't even see the enemy's figure clearly. From the beginning to the end, they didn't even have the chance to brandish their sabers and fight with the enemy. 5,000 cavalrymen were finished just like that. General, let's retreat quickly. It won't be long before the enemy arrives on the wooden raft. It'll be difficult to retreat then, the 8 bodyguards said with ugly expressions. The scene before them also made them feel a lingering fear. However, they couldn't think too much about it. Leaving this place as soon as possible was the most important thing. Alright, retreat, retreat. Translator. WQL Editor. Alim. Although Glenn was very reluctant and even wanted to take another look, he knew that there was no need for the 9 of them to stay here any longer. It was better to report the situation truthfully. When the time came, he could accept his fate. Glenn escaped. Not long after he left with his 8 bodyguards, the deputy commander of the independent regiment Xianxia arrived with a battalion of 400 cavalrymen. They first opened the sluice and released the water. Then they rushed upstream to the Shalwest side of the river. They didn't find a single enemy cavalryman. Instead, they saw all sorts of supplies thrown on the ground. Among them were many sabers, scabbards, quivers, and other combat equipment. These were the supplies that Glenn and the others had temporarily thrown down to reduce their weight. Haha, we didn't come here for nothing. Pick up all these things and bring them back. Xianxia laughed loudly. The battle was nearing its end. After the investigation, other than Glenn, who took 8 bodyguards with him when he escaped, the other 4,991 cavalrymen were mostly dead. Among them, about 600 people rushed to the other side of the river, but all of them died under the arrows and bullets. As for the other 4,000 people, at least half of them became water ghosts in the West River. They couldn't be more dead than they were. Only a few lucky ones who were good at swimming managed to escape. Sigh, if it wasn't for the urgency of the situation and the enemy's main forces arriving tomorrow, I really couldn't bear to see so many warhorses get washed away. What a pity. The commander of the independent regiment Tiger's Mane was still lamenting. In the end, he waved his hand and said, "Clean up the battlefield. Throw the enemy's corpses into the holes we dug long ago. Chop off their heads and make them into statues. Bring the warhorses back to the city. Hurry up and deal with everything." The moment Yang Chendong set up the plan to drown the enemy, the fate of the 5,000 cavalrymen seemed to have been decided. They didn't know that Yang Chendong was the best at dealing with the people. One of the things he often did was to understand the customs and habits of the people when he arrived at a place. How could he not know the structure of the bottom of the West River? This time he intentionally intercepted the flow of the river in advance to create an illusion that the enemy could cross the river. The facts also proved that the enemy was fooled and they had to pay the price in blood and lives. Tiger's Mane led the independent regiment to successfully finish the first battle. They killed 5,000 enemies without losing a single person and seized countless war supplies. When they entered the city at dawn, they were treated like heroes who had returned. The people in the beginning city spontaneously came to both sides of the streets to celebrate and cheer. They already knew that Agadorji was going to bring 50,000 cavalrymen to attack the beginning city. The grassland people who knew this person were naturally afraid. They didn't think that this person's arrival would bring them any good luck. They were worried about whether the mercenaries could successfully defend the city and continue the beautiful life that had just begun. Now that they had such a beautiful opening battle with the independent regiment, they could finally put down their worries a little. On the streets of the beginning city, in front of more than 10,000 people, Yang Chendong personally came out to welcome them. He also ordered people to bring 5 carriages of gold and silver treasures. These were all rewards for the soldiers of the independent regiment who had performed meritorious deeds. Yang Chendong also announced on the streets that no matter who it was, no matter what race they were, as long as they sincerely joined the mercenaries and performed well on the battlefield, they would be rewarded. They would have the possibility of being promoted and becoming a general to bring honor to their ancestors. Facts spoke louder than words. When the 5 carriages of shining gold and silver were placed on the streets and given to the officers of the independent regiment in front of everyone, the surrounding 10,000 people were deeply stimulated. Among them, there were some warriors who had participated in tribal wars or fought against the grassland bandits for their own safety. However, because there was no one to report to, because there were too many concerns, because they didn't receive rewards for their meritorious deeds, and so on, they chose to leave their original army and become ordinary people again. However, they were still grassland warriors in their bones. They didn't join the army and didn't join any side. It wasn't that they didn't dare to do it or didn't want to do it. It was because they didn't want to. It was because they didn't think that the people they should work for had appeared, or they felt that their efforts couldn't be proportional to what they received. But now Yang Qindong gave them a vivid lesson, letting them know that there was such an army in the world. As long as they performed meritorious deeds, they would receive sufficient rewards. Now they only had to consider whether their own abilities were enough. Do you still want people? Finally, some people in the crowd who were unwilling and moved asked a question that many people wanted to ask. That depends on the situation. Just go to the recruitment office in the city and ask. Beta Persei's loud voice came in handy. He, who had long received Yang Qindong's instructions, took the initiative to speak loudly at this moment. His voice quickly spread among the people. It didn't take long for everyone to know about this matter. Some people were also eager to give it a try. They wanted to wait for the war to end. If the mercenaries could really prove that they could defeat an enemy several times their number, then they would consider joining this army and fight for a future for their future and their descendants. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.